The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 301 Transaction. But even so, it still cannot stop the British from loving Swiss handicrafts, especially those engaged in navigation-related careers, who regard them as a symbol of status and strength. The environment at sea is harsher and more bumpy than on land, and there are also higher standards and requirements for time accuracy, so sailors are in urgent need of an object of spiritual sustenance. After all, facing the vast and endless sea without reference objects, it is easy for people to suffer from mental depression. With a watch, sailors can at least live with their fingers. In fact, going from pocket watches to wristwatches is an inevitable development process, because the pace of human life will become faster and faster, and clothing will also develop towards simplicity and lightweight. This is a historical trend. Knowing this, Franz can do a lot matter. For example, the formal clothes that Franz wears every day are perfectly normal for people of this era, but in 100 years, people who wear them all day long will be regarded as crazy. Talking back to the watch industry, even if the level of the watch factory opened by Franz is not yet up to the level of Swiss watches, it will not be much worse. But in terms of fame, I'm afraid it won't be able to compare with it for a long time. At this time, if we want to pry open the Russian market, there is no better billboard than the Tsar's family. And if the watch can really set off a trend, maybe the Austrian watch industry can also complete a counterattack. Queen Alexandra put a watch on her hand and held her husband's arm. "Dear, do you think it looks good, Nicholas?" I looked at it seriously and said, "Isn't it just a watch with a strap? Isn't it good to put it in your pocket? It's so flamboyant." Of course, Alexandra knew her husband's straight temperament, so she said it carefully. "Dear, just imagine, a lady puts her hand into the inner pocket of her skirt to fumble around in order to tell the time. I'm afraid it's not very elegant. It's much more convenient to wear it on the hand, and I think it looks good. You see, the children also like it very much, Nicholas." I just replied lightly, "As long as you like it, then." He said to Archduke Carol, "Carol, let's go. My children are also excellent hunters. Olga Nikolaevna, Alexandra Nikolaevna, Konstantin Nikolaevich, Nikolay Nikolaevich, Mikhail Nikolaevich." Among the 6 children of Nicholas I who are still in Russia, only Alexander did not come. Queen Alexandra's explanation was that she was newly married and had a sweet and intimate relationship, so she could not be present. But in fact, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince was wandering around somewhere, especially since Section 3 searched all over St. Petersburg and couldn't find him. The Special Third Section was a secret service organization directly affiliated with the Tsar, similar to Austria's secret police force. Although it was smaller in number, it was much more efficient. On the outskirts of St. Petersburg, the royal hunting grounds, there was a gunshot, and then a brown bear 150 meters away let out an angry roar. A bullet hit it in the abdomen. Fear and anger overwhelmed its mind, and it chose to attack the crowd. "Don't shoot yet, Nicholas," I said. At this time, facing the brown bear running at high speed, Archduke Carol raised his gun, took aim and pulled the trigger. There was another gunshot, and the brown bear was hit in the forelimb and immediately fell to the ground, but still roared angrily. But the struggle soon ceased. The Tsar's gun had been loaded, and he shot the brown bear in the forehead. The bullet penetrated the skull, and gurgling blood flowed out. I don't know who took the lead in shouting, "Your Majesty the Great Tsar Allah, Ula, Ula." The Tsar had a great harvest today. In one afternoon, they hunted 3 bears, 1 tiger, 5 deer, and 12 rabbits. The accompanying officials naturally tried their best to praise the Tsar's shooting skills. Only he knew that this was entirely due to the new bullets. Just like what Archduke Carol said, this kind of bullet not only fills quickly but also has extremely high accuracy. A skilled shooter like him can complete the loading in only 10 seconds. During this period, it was generally believed that reloading speed was equal to firepower, and the design of the bullet was at the bottom of the box. Faced with such a generous gift, so Nicholas I was a little overwhelmed. "Carol, my friend, I really don't know how to thank you. This gift is so great. After saying that, Nicholas I called his 2 daughters over. These are Olga and Nikolaevna. They are my most precious treasures. If possible, I hope they can marry your sons. Nicholas. I had only met Albrecht, and he had a good impression of the young man. He was a very brave young man and an outstanding soldier. In fact, marriage with Austria has always been within the Tsar's consideration. Last time, he hoped that his eldest son Alexander could marry the youngest daughter of Archduke Karol. Because Russia really needs an ally, and the British are like a mountain lingering above his head. In the previous crisis, Russia was increasingly isolated, which was not what the Tsar wanted to see. Although he does not want Austria to compete with it for hegemony in the Balkans, it is better than falling to the enemy. Your Majesty, I'm flattered by your generosity, but it is better for the children to decide their own affairs. Although Archduke Karol was very rigid in many aspects, he was extremely liberal when it came to his children's marriage. As a result, his children led to many strange marriages. In fact, Archduke Karol's own marriage was very strange, because he married a Protestant, which was definitely considered a high priority among the Habsburg family, who claimed to be the guardian of Catholicism at the time. The above is an alien among aliens. Oh. What do you want, my friend? Nicholas I was a very cheerful person, so he spoke directly. I want to discuss a business with His Majesty. Our country's textile industry requires a large amount of cotton, and this crop cannot be grown on Austrian soil. Archduke Karol actually didn't quite understand Franz's purpose, but he believed in his elder brother's vision. Of course, even if he was wrong, it was because Franz II had nothing to do with him. Cotton? Nicholas I didn't know much about the economy. He only knew that his country earned foreign exchange by exporting grain and timber. Hilarion. Nicholas I called the Prime Minister Hilarion Vasilievich Vasilchikov, and the Prime Minister trotted all the way to the Tsar's side. Your Majesty, what are your orders? My friend wants to buy cotton. Let's talk. Nicholas I said, but Hilarion immediately looked embarrassed. What happened? Your Majesty, we in Russia are also cotton importers. Hilarion replied. Nicholas I immediately frowned, but he felt that the design of this bullet was much more valuable than some piece of shit cotton. He was about to ask Hilarion to meet Archduke Karol's request. Your Majesty, your land in southern Russia, the Black Sea and the Caucasus is actually suitable for growing cotton, but the local officials don't know it. Chapter 302 The Woolly Bear Growing Cotton. Before 1860, the Russians had to pay the price for a long time because of a major mistake in the location of cotton planting areas in the territory of the Russian Empire that stretches across the Eurasian continent. Central Asia is an ideal base for the development of the cotton textile industry. However, at this time, this land has not yet been completely held by the woolly bears. What's more serious is that, because they designated Moscow and its surrounding areas as cotton cultivation areas, their mistakes and negligence resulted in extremely low yields, and forced them to import from abroad. Nicholas I, who had an evil tiger in his chest, was on the verge of going berserk. His cold and sharp eyes glanced at Hilarion, which made the overwhelmed latter feel deeply uncomfortable. He had no choice but to call the Minister of Agriculture Yevgeny Garlilik. Your Majesty, please forgive my presumptuous words. The report submitted by the Imperial Ministry of Agriculture shows that there is no cotton there, only grain. You stupid guy, what are you thinking about? Are you so stupid that you can't even understand a simple and clear question like whether you can grow cotton, and you still need your Tsar to answer it for you? Nicholas. I snorted coldly and said that the fat-headed loser in front of him was simply not worthy of staying in this important position that controlled the lifeblood of Russia. It was time for him to go to the Urals or Siberia to sober up. I'm sorry, my Majesty, I really don't deserve your trust. I really don't know. Yevgeny, a veteran official in the officialdom, replied calmly. Because the Tsar disliked civil servants, he did not pay much attention to the construction of the official system under his rule, so he rarely personally intervened in the appointment and dismissal of officials. The ruler's inattention naturally allowed many smooth and mediocre bureaucrats to take advantage of the loopholes, including Mr. Yevgeny, who had a body like Hermann Mier's deceptive strategy of ignoring every question and pretending to be stupid naturally failed to satisfy his immediate superiors, and the consequence was to make Nicholas I even more distrustful of the civil service group in St. Petersburg. Who among you can answer the question of whether cotton can be cultivated on the land of Astrakhan and Stavropol? Embarrassingly, no one answered him in the entire Winter Palace's reception hall, which made the tall Tsar furious, but he couldn't continue to get angry in front of distinguished guests. I'm very sorry, my friend. Although my officials don't seem to be good at cotton cultivation, as long as there is a suitable place for the growth of this crop, I can guarantee that the local output can be used to trade with your country. Are you satisfied, Archduke? Carol nodded involuntarily. Okay, Your Majesty. Our country's agricultural scholars and consultants are optimistic about the prospects of cotton trade between our two countries. It can not only make Russia's agricultural layout more reasonable, but also increase your country's income. Increasing fiscal and tax revenue was something that was close to Nicholas I's heart, because Russia was so poor that the first thing he thought of in return was his daughter. Of course, there are also political factors to consider, but it also illustrates Russia's economic difficulties from the side. In fact, the quality of Russian cotton is far inferior to that of the United States and Egypt, but it is superior to large quantities and adequate management. Moreover, the reason why France spared no effort to help Russia, apart from the political need for allies, was that Russia's industry was almost blank, and they could not consume so much cotton. At this time, opening up trade became an inevitable choice, so Austria could import cotton from Russia and sell it to the Russians. Exporting cotton to Austria will become an important industry for Russia for a long time, but their textile industry is basically finished, which completes the first step of economic colonization. Don't think it's ridiculous. There have been cases in history where European merchants purchased wheat in Russia, then ground it into flour, and sold it back. In fact, promoting cotton cultivation in southern Russia, the Black Sea, and the Caucasus will also help Russia stabilize its domestic situation. After all, the rebels also need to eat. No matter how wild and untamed they are, they can't stand up if they are hungry. Of course, there is no way of knowing whether the Tsar himself could have thought of this level, or whether he would do so. Trade with Austria will indeed bring considerable benefits to Russia, but more of them will be benefits to the government and nobles. Even the lives of serfs may be improved, but businessmen and the bourgeoisie will not necessarily make profits. Probably due to the massive entry of Austrian goods, it was a complete failure. After the success of cotton cultivation in Russia, the Ottoman Empire was bound to increase its cotton planting area. At the same time, with the development of trade, the importance of the straits to Russia will become higher and higher, which will further deepen the contradiction between the two major groups in the Near East. Oh my God, Carol, you are my savior. All my civil servants are idiots compared to you. They should all be sent to Siberia to dig potatoes. The relieved Nicholas I finally couldn't help but tell the truth. In his eyes, only people with military background are the most trustworthy. For example, the important position of Russian foreign minister is held by Naserlov, who has a military background. Your Majesty, you are exaggerating. Russia and Austria are allies of the Holy Alliance. The friendship between the Habsburg and Romanov families has a long history, so we should support each other. Although they were all polite words, they spoke to Nicholas I's heart. The latter always likes to hear this kind of politeness coupled with the previous gifts. The leader of the European gendarmerie has become more determined to maintain and consolidate the Russian-Austrian alliance. After that, there was an interactive session between a military enthusiast and an expert. Nicholas I consulted the latter on many related issues. As an excellent commander, Archduke Carol naturally had unique insights into the current situation. He believed that Russia should maximize its strengths and avoid weaknesses as much as possible, and avoid direct combat with powerful enemies at sea. Instead, it should adopt a strategy of luring the enemy deep into the country and attack from land at the same time. Firstly, it is to take full advantage of the Russian army's huge military advantage, and secondly, it is to do everything possible to weaken the enemy's effective strength. Once you gain an advantage on the battlefield, you should immediately adopt a step-by-step strategy to continue to erode the enemy's will to fight, and finally achieve the goal of forcing the opponent to the negotiation table point. No matter how much the pro-British faction under his command tried, they could not shake the fact that Russia's imaginary enemy was Britain. Therefore, Archduke Karol's suggestion was a first-class feasible plan in terms of feasibility and operability point, but this plan was soon forgotten because of two words: profit. After Nicholas I received huge orders from the cotton trade of his Western allies, he became more confident to reject the Anglo-Saxon Channel Agreement. The Russians' assertive attitude irritated London, which did not want the behemoth to the east to retain Black Sea supremacy because, as one politician explained in the Palace of Westminster, this is the biggest threat and challenge to peace and freedom in the Near East. Chapter 303 The Archbishop's Confession. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz has been having a headache recently because Archbishop Prussia comes to him all day long to confess what he was doing was nothing more than inviting the French to go to the Central American Federation to counter rebellion. Not only has France not gained any benefit from its presence in Central America over the years, it has also spent hundreds of millions of francs on military expenditures and the lives of tens of thousands of French soldiers, but France is not the only victim. The Central American Federation has suffered a sharp drop in income due to the continuous war, and people's lives are miserable. Of course, the French did not gain anything, such as Carrera, the leader of the rebel army. The French hoped to end the war by putting Carrera on trial and take away the benefits they deserved. But the former Central American Federation President Ramazan once again showed his talent. Ramazan led his followers to surround the French prison and then broke into the prison and executed Carrera without trial. The French despised Ramazan's approach, but for the huge profits he promised, they had to endure it for the time being. Ramazan then resumed his reign of terror, adopting even more aggressive tactics than before he was ousted. Coupled with the pressure to repay the money, Ramazan began a large-scale liquidation. The reason why he did this was, of course, to stabilize his rule and eradicate dissidents. Just when Ramazan felt that he was about to return to his peak, rebellion resumed and a larger scale civil war broke out. As Franz had judged before, the so-called devil Carrera was nothing more than a swineherd. Ramazan's rule is the source of trouble. Today a Pirda can rebel, and tomorrow a Shifada may rebel. But I have to say that France is still very trustworthy. Even so, Ramazan did not suddenly disappear or die suddenly. Instead, King Louis Philippe gave him a French title. But the biggest loser among them is the Catholic Church. Before Ramazan's reform, they owned 70% of the country's land. Even after the reform, they only controlled 25% of the country's land. However, since the civil war has started today, the land of the Central American Federation Church has reached less than 5% of the country. Countless churches have been burned down, priests have been massacred, and nuns have been forced to marry local indigenous people. These people could only seek help from the churches in France and Austria. Of course, they also went to Rome, but they could not afford the high meeting fees and had to give up. Yes, Pope Gregory XVI at this time was a very greedy person. Under his rule, everything in the Holy See was clearly priced. At this time, it was naturally impossible for the priests of the Central American Federation to still have money to get the Pope favor. At this time, the French Church was also in a difficult situation. Many people thought that the war would end soon, and they would be able to control the entire federation like the Austrian Church, and even establish a clerical state. Many church leaders had placed heavy bets on Ramazan, so they are in a dilemma at this time. If they change agents now, all the previous investment will be wasted, and even if they change, there may not be any changes. But if Ramazan is not replaced, his various behaviors will make the church lose hope, and he will have to endure criticism from his peers. Of course, the reason why the French government spared no effort to fight this terrible war was not because of the influence of the church or its strategy of attacking Mexico from the north to the south. Dealing with Mexico first is almost an inevitable choice, because the United States is too big and has a good maritime force. In addition, the United States has trade relations with the United Kingdom, Austria and other countries, which makes France dare not act rashly. But now France has a new target, the Viceroyalty of La Plata, which will later become Argentina. This was supposed to be Spain's territory, and later, like Mexico, it took advantage of Spain's decline to become independent. But at this time, France and Spain had formed an alliance, and Louis Philippe's youngest son was engaged to the Queen of Spain, so it became a good excuse to help the in-laws solve internal problems. In fact, France had conflicts with Argentina before. Argentina wanted to implement trade protection policies. This move angered France, and directly sent a fleet to blockade Buenos Aires. Juan Manuel de Rosas, the Lord of War in South America, could only meet France's demands in exchange for peace. Of course, this is still the case with the British mediation, otherwise it would not be as simple as siege and blockade. Compared with the Central American Federation, which is surrounded by mountains and remote areas, the Argentine Federation can be described as a paradise on earth. It has many mining areas, large pastures, and rich resources that make people salivate. Moreover, the rule of Juan Manuel de Rosas was not stable. This king of war went to war everywhere, but he knelt down to Britain and France. What was even more unacceptable to the domestic opposition was Rosas joining forces with Argentina's arch-rivals, the Brazilians. The opposition, led by Justo José de Urquiza, a senior official in Intrígues, secretly contacted France, hoping to use the power of the French to overthrow Rosas' rule. Their logic is very simple, that is, because Brazil is in contact with Austria, Argentina should join forces with Austria's mortal enemy France. Anyway, they cannot make the same choice as the Brazilians. After learning the news, Guizot and Louis Philippe would not let go of this opportunity. After all, Argentina was much weaker than Mexico and the United States. Although Argentina's area is 4 times that of France, its population is less than 1/50th of France's, with only more than 600,000 people. How could the French tolerate such a piece of fat? So Congress asked the military to end this costly war as soon as possible. But this kind of security war cannot be ended if you want to, because even if you want to sign a peace treaty, you can't find anyone. As a result, Marshal Magnan de Rochefort, commander of the French Expeditionary Force, adopted a policy of extermination to thoroughly clean up the rebels and those who supported the rebels. French Expeditionary Force soldiers were allowed to shoot anyone who might be a rebel and loot supplies that might help fund the rebels. This was strongly opposed by Lamoisin, who felt that the French were plundering his property. But Marshal Magnan de Rochefort ignored Lamoisin's protests, and he knew that, if he followed the other party's advice, he might not be able to end this war in his lifetime. Marshal Magnan de Rochefort knew his duty. He was responsible first for his country, not for Lamoisin and the priests. The intensity and bloodiness of the Central American battlefields increased rapidly. At first, the French only attacked the indigenous people, but soon it spread to the native whites, and even purebred whites were not immune. At this time, they remembered Archbishop Rocha, who gave them advice. The power of the church in Austria has increased a lot over the years, but it is simply wishful thinking to interfere in French military operations. Ever since, Archbishop Rocha remembered the person who gave him advice. Of course, due to Franz's special status, he naturally cannot accuse Franz like the Central American priests. He can only come to Franz every day to confess his crimes in the name of explaining the Bible. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 304, Ways to End the War. I understand what you mean, and I sympathize with the suffering of the people in Central America. But the main culprit of the civil unrest is their own elected leaders. Archbishop Rocha looked surprised by these remarks about a born saint in his own eyes. This is actually not surprising. The church and other parties have used their own interests to beautify and whitewash this stupid ruler. Archduke Franz, are you referring to President Morazan? But he is the only person who can save the Central American Federation. Only he can maintain the fragile balance between different groups with different interests and demands. What if there is a different rule? I'm afraid that it is really impossible to coordinate the relationship between the indigenous people, native whites, European whites and the French. After hearing this, Franz shook his head repeatedly and said that he was helpless. He trusted his own intelligence network more than the archbishop's words. Then, you should go find the great President Lamazan. And according to my estimation, the French only need to kill for a while to end this war. After all, they are taking the most efficient method now. Archbishop Prussia was shocked. He did not expect Franz to say such cruel words so calmly. Your Highness, the merciful God will not agree with the most efficient method you call it. Franz has always questioned the theological level of this magician. This discussion further confirmed the former's impression that the latter only took this position because of the family's protection. God is merciful, but he also needs to send down brimstone and fire from time to time to warn the world. The monarchs on earth also need to do the same. And how can mortals know God's thoughts? This can be regarded as Franz's ultimatum. He just can't find a substitute for the time being, but he does not intend to restore the church. At this time, he must express his attitude and let the archbishop in front of him realize who is the master. Franz's wariness of the church began from the moment he had to decide to use its power, but in the eyes of the archbishop, it was a different scene. He felt that Franz's understanding of the Bible was beyond ordinary people, and this was one of the characteristics of a born saint. He only needed to listen to the teachings. You are right. It is a duty to end the suffering of the people of Central America. Please rest assured that the Imperial Church will always be your strongest support. Archbishop Prussia was indeed a devout believer, but he was never loyal to the Pope from beginning to end. After speaking, Archbishop Prussia took out a box from his clothes and solemnly handed it to Franz. What's this? This is a printed list of fighting brothers trained by the church, as well as relevant intelligence about our supporters in the Central American Federation. In fact, these confidential documents are the result of years of painstaking experience by Prussia and his subordinates. It has been some time since the last internal meeting of the Austrian Church passed a resolution to expand to Central America, but it has never found the opportunity to intervene. However, Franz did not pay much attention to the capital of the church. After all, after the 30 Years' War, almost all European churches could no longer influence the politics of the country. But after a brief glance, he still felt frightened. With ample funds as financial backing, the size of Astartes has expanded from 800 a few years ago to 5,000 people, more than 6 times the previous number, and its so-called supporters are spread throughout the Central American Federation. Great, you can use these 2 channels to influence the supporters of Nicaragua and Costa Rica, and finally convince them to become independent and negotiate a separate peace with the French. Franz's words puzzled Prussia, because the reason for France's intervention in the Central American Civil War was to prevent the disintegration of the Central American Federation. How could the massive sacrifices and expenditures made for this cause it to change its course easily? After pondering for a while, he raised his objection. I have to remind you that this suggestion may not have any appeal to either the French or Lamazan. Even if both parties do make certain concessions, I'm afraid that extremely harsh preconditions will be set. Archbishop Russia's concerns are not unreasonable, but this is the case. You are wrong, Archbishop. It doesn't matter what Lamazan thinks. We just need to convince the French. As you said, this proposal did not interest them before, but now the situation has changed. It will not do them any good to prolong this war any longer. In fact, Prussia was still worried that the ruler of the Central American Federation would lead his army to attack Nicaragua and Costa Rica. At this time, these 2 pieces of land were recognized as out and out bad land and could not satisfy the church's ambition to expand its power in Central America and the Caribbean. Of course, Franz never intended to swallow up all of Central America. Even if conditions permit, the cost of doing so is too high. In fact, not only would Franz not monopolize the entire Central American Federation, he would also drag Britain into the chaotic situation in Central America. After all, Britain has coveted Honduras gold and high-quality harbors for a long time. How could they let this opportunity pass? At this time, the relatively developed areas of the Central American Federation were Guatemala and Honduras. The 2 places were famous for their rich production of gold, silver and high-quality timber, and had long been coveted by Western powers. But what good would the independence of Nicaragua and Costa Rica do to us? Today's Nicaragua is not as famous for its gold production as it was in later generations. Instead, it is described as a cursed land. Muddy swamps and overflowing lakes are everywhere, and the resulting breeding of various mosquitoes and poisonous snakes, as well as natural disasters and diseases, etc. All this confirms its reputation as a cursed place. What's even more fatal is that the local population is always on a downward trend and labor has to be imported from other countries. Its large and rich gold veins were not discovered until the end of the 20th century because they were buried deep. At the same time, Nicaragua's isolation was exacerbated by the somewhat defensive Great Wall built to resist invasion from El Salvador and Honduras, and Costa Rica is an undeveloped land. Today, 80% of its population is concentrated near the eastern coast, and its economy depends on agriculture and fishing. The central part is separated by rugged mountains, and the western part is almost uninhabited. At least we ended the war and saved those innocent people. This is the most important thing, isn't it? The plausible and irrefutable truth of a born saint made Roche feel a little ashamed. A religious leader who often talks about saving the world actually talks about profit, while another mortal who pursues efficiency does not ask for anything in return. The sun really rises from the west. Of course, Franz is not a madman who only talks about dedication without asking for anything in return. It's just that there is no need to tell everything as soon as possible. After all, it's good to keep a trump card when dealing with people, otherwise it would be very uncomfortable to be manipulated. After hesitating for a long time, Archbishop Roche couldn't help but ask, then do we still need to stay and continue to help those who are suffering? Chapter 305, Dividing the Spoils. Why not? Archbishop, the lost lambs need the right guidance. This is the duty of the shepherd. The two people spoke relatively vaguely, but Archbishop Roche understood what Franz meant. These two countries still need the church to contribute to the aftermath. It was a bit disappointing not to get the relatively wealthy Guatemala and Honduras, but Archbishop Roche decided to try his best to implement Franz's plan. After all, in Southeast Asia before, no one could figure out why Franz would choose Chenla, a land without foundation, instead of Vietnam, where the church was stronger, and Siam, Thailand, where the economy was developed. But the final result proved that Archduke Franz's judgment was correct. At this time, Chenla became the only country in the world controlled by the church besides the Papal States. Sure enough, the proposal was immediately approved by the French after it was revealed through secret channels. Of course, the Tuileries Palace has no reason to reject this proposal. After all, this can directly reduce the number of enemies by 1/3. The Paris authorities immediately ignored Lamarzane's objections, unilaterally made peace with the two countries, and recognized their independent status. But the price of peace is high. The two governments had to accept the harsh conditions of paying war compensation of 5 million francs, which is undoubtedly worse for the two weak countries with annual government income of less than 1 million francs. Guizot, the driving force behind the scenes, also had his own considerations. As Marshal Magnan de Rochefort described, it is certainly a very good idea to support a puppet government after direct unconditional peace, but France has paid too much in the Central American Federation. Unless the domestic bureaucrats and financial capitalists are impressed with tangible benefits, these stingy and greedy guys will never agree to continue to add money to a bunch of gold-eating beasts that require large investments. In fact, in the early stages of colonial development, the cost is often very high, so it is called the gold-swallowing beast. On July 15, 1841, as soon as the armistice agreement was announced, the local wealthy businessmen and mineowners in Honduras immediately united to offer an olive branch to the French expeditionary force. First, they will not make any unfriendly moves towards the French army. Second, they are willing to pay a one-time payment of 5 million war reparations. Of course, this little trick will not take the bait of France, which has experienced hundreds of battles, and has long been chatting and laughing with other colonial powers. Like other colonists, the French soldiers and adventurers came all the way for the land and gold in Central America. How could a mere 8 million francs fill their hungry hearts? As expected, after rejecting the proposals of local capitalists, the French issued a list of war reparations of 100 million francs, with the requirement to cede the port of La Ceiba and grant France most favored nation status and the right to build and operate railways. At this point, France's ambitions are obvious. But the businessmen and mineowners in Honduras have no bargaining power. After all, the other party has a gun in their hand, and it is easy to find any excuse to launch an armed collection operation. At this time, the world's #1 shit taker with an extremely sensitive sense of smell took the initiative to mediate with his old rival. After learning about the independence of Honduras, the reason why the British sense of smell is so keen is that, in addition to Franz's obstruction, Lamartine is also dissatisfied with the French's damage to their own property point, so he thought of a good way, which was to use barbarians to control barbarians and let the British deal with the French, so that he could continue to have both sides. But what surprised Lamartine was that the British and French started dividing the spoils directly, ignoring him as the victim. In fact, there was very strong opposition within the French government to the British request to monopolize Honduras. This time it was not only the Bonapartists who clamored for war with the British, but even the financial capitalists who had always been the most opposed to war also advocated war, because France had paid too much in the Central American Federation and the gold and silver mines in Honduras, its so important point in the end. It was Giselle who overcame all opinions and decided to make concessions to the British for his so-called British-French goodwill, and agreed to transfer Honduras to the British. However, the British must also bear Honduras's war compensation of 30 million francs, and must support France's occupation of Guatemala and El Salvador under the pretext of debt disputes. At this time, Ramazan, who was enjoying the joy of victory in Guatemala City, did not know that he had actually become the fish on the chopping board, and had even divided the plates, after receiving a positive reply from Paris. The commander of the French expeditionary force, Marshal Magnan de Rochefort, immediately ordered the arrest of Lamartine, and demanded that he immediately pay a debt of 1 billion francs. Lamartine naturally disagreed. Even if he agreed, he did not have so much money. At the same time, he also refused to sign the colonial agreement. But there are many people in the Central American Federation who want to end the war. After fighting for so many years, all the factions in the Central American Federation are exhausted. In the past, the driving force that supported them in not surrendering was the fear of Lamartine's future settlement. Now that scourge is gone, they are very willing to be French subjects. The civil war of the Central American Federation ended here. Guatemala and El Salvador became French colonies. Honduras was an independent country in name and protected by the British, but in fact the government and main economic lifeline were controlled by the British. Nicaragua and Costa Rica in the southeast declared independence, but were actually controlled by the Austrian Church. The US government once again reiterated the Monroe Doctrine and demanded that the French government return power to the legitimate government of the Central American Federation. In fact, as the Texas region becomes increasingly prosperous, the contradiction between France and the United States is also deepening. At this time, the United States is not a beacon country for future generations, but France is. Moreover, France has always been very generous in the development of colonies. Texas has developed rapidly in the hands of France, and the length of the railway is even longer than that of France. At the same time, the Texans were also treated very favorably legally. They could enjoy almost the same treatment as the French, and the French laws brought order, security, and fairness that they had never enjoyed before. After the French gendarmes arrived, even the most powerful family in Texas, with hundreds of cowboys, did not dare to act as peace officers or confront the French government. In fact, the early West was not as beautiful as described in the movies. It was common for bandits to consider themselves sheriffs, large families to control local militias, and to organize gangs to rob good people on the Great Plains. Those gangs massacred Indians and had no problem dealing with the mercenaries of the US government, but they seemed embarrassed when facing the real French army. Those seemingly stupid tactics knocked these proud cowboys out of their minds. The French did not respect military ethics and frequently used artillery to attack gang strongholds. Due to the influence of Napoleon, artillery played a very important role in the French army at this time. If you did not fire two cannons during a battle, it would be as if you were not French closer to home. Although Guizot's behavior maintained peace with Britain, it was achieved at the expense of French interests and French national sentiments, which laid hidden dangers for the future. If I have time today, I should add another chapter tonight. Chapter 306. The American back garden is riddled with holes. London, England. The cabinet was very excited to find this huge bargain. Not only did they get a colony rich in gold, silver, and high quality timber, they didn't even have to pay for it themselves. This couldn't be described as simple luck. The Whigs resigned collectively, but after a series of operations by Queen Victoria, they became the ruling party again. The reason was actually just that the personal relationship between the Queen and Lord Russell was better, but unlike others, Palmerston was not satisfied with this victory, and he seemed to have found a pattern. That is, the French did not dare to be tough on Britain. Gentlemen, are you satisfied with this? The cabinet members all turned to look at Palmerston and couldn't help but think to themselves, what bad idea does this guy have? Why would he be dissatisfied with such a great victory without spending a single soldier? What a madman. Viscount Palmerston, what do you want to say? There are two countries in Central America, Nicaragua and Costa Rica. Palmerston said, you want us to invade two independent countries. John Russell had always been opposed to Palmerston's radical expansion policy. He felt that internal relations should be strengthened first to prevent worker riots and colonial rebellions at the same time. John Russell was also very jealous of Palmerston's talent, because that was what he lacked. No, it's protection. Just like we protect Honduras, Palmerston, on the other hand, was completely unafraid of questioning. On the contrary, he enjoyed the challenge. After hearing Palmerston's explanation, all the British cabinet members laughed. Only Russell remained gloomy and didn't know what he was thinking. As a result, Britain extended an olive branch to Nicaragua and Costa Rica, hoping that these two weak countries could accept the protection of Great Britain. But it was rejected, so Britain was ready to send troops to conduct some friendly negotiations. The result of the negotiation was surprising. One of the two troop transport ships ran aground, so the two ships were forced to anchor on the coast. As a result, they were ambushed by local armed forces. As soon as they landed, 700 soldiers, 130 people are missing, 75 people are dead, and 201 people are injured. The British had to temporarily give up the idea of negotiation, or send a larger negotiation team. But they soon understood the cause of the fiasco, for both countries declared themselves protectorates of Austria and released British prisoners. Although Austria is not a naval power, let alone a colonial power, Britain will not go to war with other powers casually, even if it is a landlubber. Moreover, it is a common practice in this era for emerging independent countries to find a big brother to cover them in Europe. It is understandable that Nicaragua and Costa Rica chose Austria. Palmerston was extremely dissatisfied. He felt that this was an Austrian conspiracy and demanded that troops be sent to attack Nicaragua and Costa Rica from land and seize Austrian merchant ships. But this time his proposal met with fierce opposition from the cabinet. Britain could not fall out with Austria over two bad pieces of land, and the French had also extended their influence into Central America. If the two countries joined forces, the situation would be unfavorable to Britain. From the perspective of global hegemony, France and Austria are both targets that Britain needs to win over, and they cannot be allowed to fall to Russia's side. In addition, the French's experiences in Central America and their own experiences in Afghanistan made the British government very afraid of mountain warfare. Palmerston insisted that the French would never dare to be enemies of Britain. But no one was willing to take this risk, let alone take it. At the same time, the President of the United States once again issued a protest against the colonial behavior of European powers in the Americas, which was a blasphemy against the Monroe Declaration. The then President of the United States, John Tyler, once again reiterated the contents of the Monroe Declaration. 1. Request European countries not to colonize the Western Hemisphere. This principle not only expresses opposition to the expansion of Western European countries in Latin America, but also opposes Russia's expansion on the west coast of North America. 2. Demand that Europe not interfere in the affairs of independent American countries. 3. Ensure that the United States does not interfere in European affairs, including the affairs of Europe's existing colonies in the Americas, but for the European powers. This is just a joke. That is not funny. Austria and the United Kingdom have not made a clear stance due to their close trade ties with the United States. However, since France is allied with Spain and both sides have a lot of interests in the Americas, it is impossible to accept the so-called Monroe Declaration. It openly accuses the United States of wanting to monopolize the American continent, and resolutely refuses to accept the intimidation of the Americans. This is quite inconsistent. The posture is about to start a war. The previous disastrous defeat in Texas is still fresh in the minds of the generals of the US Army. Although the size of the US Army has expanded more than 5 times compared to that time, no general dares to say that he can win Texas. Even you can't take San Antonio Point, in fact, not to mention San Antonio, even Fort Dallas, the northern gate of Texas, the US military was not sure of capturing, because the French built a huge group of fortresses here. There were even conflicts within the US military regarding the declaration of war against France. The army requested a naval blockade of France, but at this time there were 6 French battleships parked in the port of Houston. These big guys were not something that the US's small tonnage cruisers could handle. At this time, the port of Houston had been named Port Phillip by the French in memory of their great king. John Tyler's historical evaluation as the President of the United States is not high, not because of lack of ability, but simply because he was on the wrong team. After his death, he was whipped to death by Lincoln, which made him the most disliked person in American history. But in fact, he was very capable. In history, it was John Tyler who annexed Texas, successfully pushed the British out of Oregon, redrawn the US-Canada border, used diplomatic means to resolve conflicts between Britain and the United States, and used despicable means, forcing other countries to sign one unequal treaty after another. The ruthless plundering of Indians at home thwarted the conspiracy of the big industrial and commercial bourgeoisie to manipulate finance and monopolize federal power. He signed the Preemption Act, which was the most important land measure passed by the US government since its establishment. Reform the Navy, rectify taxation, and bloody suppress rebellions. John Taylor judged, based on the military's rhetoric alone, that the US military was not ready for war at all, so he had to make concessions to France. However, the United States did not recognize France's rights to Central America, and secretly funded anti-French, anti-British, and anti-Austrian forces in the hope of mobilizing local people to drive Western powers out of the Americas. What's even more frightening is that the Americans actually rescued Ramazan from prison by unknown means, but the situation he faced at this time was much more severe than in history. Britain, France, and Austria had all entered the Americas. Although the civil war in Mexico continued, compared with the average of more than 100 riots a year, one changed every 4 months. I don't know how much stronger Mexico has become under this administration. Chapter 307 Empty the Cage and Change the Bird. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz was not surprised that the true identity of the insider secretly supported by the US government was a spy sent by the Austrian Church. At this time, there was no help from relatively complete counterintelligence systems such as the well-known FBI and National Security Agency, NSA, in later generations. It is not surprising that there was a lack of experience in instigating rebellion, and it is understandable that there were inhumane negligence. Not only will he not take the initiative to lend a helping hand to help Washington correct this serious mistake, on the contrary, he plans to use the plan to prepare for both sides. On the one hand, he will take the funds provided by the Americans, and on the other hand, he will take action to clean up those internal unstable factors. Archduke Franz, the output of Nicaragua and Costa Rica is very pessimistic. If we continue to invest, it is very likely that our colonial enterprise in Central and North America will fall into loss. And according to church informants, the intelligence seems to be difficult for the locals to control. Jenny has questions about the mess that Franz took over the Central American Federation. The people living on this land have a strong will to resist, and its complex terrain is far more difficult to conquer than those of African countries. A strong Spanish cultural legacy left over from hundreds of years of colonial rule would probably take dozens or even hundreds of years to completely erase its imprint. I know. How much will it cost? Franz said casually, planning a very important voyage in his mind. It's probably between 2 million and 3 million florins, but 15 million florins need to be invested in the early stage. If you include the previous 10 million francs war compensation, the total is about 20 million florins. Based on this calculation, it will take us about 10 years to recover the cost. but coupled with the expenditure on public security maintenance and dealing with special events such as possible uprisings and natural and man-made disasters, it may take longer. In fact, Ajani left out the worst case scenario. Years of war have almost turned Nicaragua and Costa Rica into ruins. It is still unknown how long it will take to resume production. Another important factor that has long troubled and restricted local development is the scarcity of population. Number of indigenous and immigrants. In the past, the authorities of the two countries have relied on indentured slaves and imported black slaves to solve local development problems. Obviously, this road is unavailable now because, like other European countries, the Austrian Empire explicitly prohibits the slave trade, not to mention that Archduke Franz himself seems to be extremely disgusted with it. Well, it's a lot better than I thought. Franz responded, still absent-mindedly. He was still thinking about the information from the Admiralty. It seemed that this voyage would be full of uncertainties. This is still under the favorable situation that our side has already controlled the local situation. Otherwise this voyage would be impossible to talk about. Archduke Franz, what's wrong with you? Are you feeling uncomfortable somewhere? Ajani began to realize something was wrong. After all, the Grand Duke's thinking had always been quick, but today his behavior was a little abnormal. Franz looked down subconsciously and then said very calmly, "Oh, it's nothing. Don't worry, it's not the worst case scenario." His inconsistent words left Ajani a little confused. So, what do you think is the worst case scenario? Britain and France joined forces to completely exclude us from Central America. Ajani was speechless for a while. According to the information and intelligence she had in hand, the chance of that extreme situation happening was so small that there was no need to discuss it. So, do you already have a response plan? Franz shook his head, and now she was speechless and felt even more depressed. Then, I can only remind you that you need to pay 10 million florins in advance for construction and other expenses in Nicaragua and Costa Rica. The empire's colonial institutions are simply empty frames, because the relevant funds have been Archduke Friedrich appropriated the navy given to him. I don't blame him, who makes the navy itself a gold-eating beast. But having said that, this has no impact on our plans in Central and North America. Ajani is a little confused. There are no local tyrants and evil gentry in Nicaragua and Costa Rica who can suck blood, and a small number of wealthy landowners have either fled to other areas or been absorbed by the church and developed into insiders. But without any initial capital investment, it would be difficult to reach even 700,000 florins per year just through taxation in those inefficient plantations. Don't worry about this. Nicaragua and Costa Rica are already part of the expansion territory of the Imperial Church. In this case, all expenses will be borne by them. They are not short of money anyway. In addition, the indigenous people are not without it. Do you like imperial rule? Then send them to California. Franz's behavior made Ajani even more confused, because Nicaragua and Costa Rica themselves are very short of labor. If workers are sent to California, a vast and sparsely populated place, will the plan to colonize these two places remain unchanged? Is it meaningless? With all due respect, what exactly are you planning to do? Empty the cage and change the bird? Franz looked at her with puzzled eyes and said slowly, in fact, it is not difficult to understand that it took Spain hundreds of years to gain a foothold in the Americas. But we do not have hundreds of years to slowly assimilate the local indigenous people, and with the intervention of Britain and France, Central America will sooner or later become a major power, a key area of competition. At this time, Ajani suddenly remembered the previous agreement signed between Austria and Mexico. She thought that Franz would attract locals from Spain and Mexico to immigrate to California. She never expected that Nicaragua and Costa Rica would become the to transport the main force point, but she still couldn't understand why he said that Central America would become one of the battlefields for great powers to compete for hegemony in the future. Maybe it was because of precious metals, but judging from the usual methods of the great powers in the fight for colonies at this time, they would not go to the point of starting a war if they disagreed, just because the other party used some shady means. But facing the questions from his subordinates, Franz seemed very helpless. He couldn't tell her directly that a big canal would be dug here in the future, and he would directly control the fate of the two continents. In fact, Panama is not the only region suitable for canal construction. Nicaragua is also suitable, and the transportation capacity of Nicaragua's canal is far greater than that of the Panama Canal, and of course the cost and engineering volume are also greater. However, it is more appropriate to give this role of being taken advantage of to other countries. After all, it only hurts when someone is hit with a stick, but as a result, the local population will be even less sufficient, and I'm afraid that even the existing tax revenue and output cannot be guaranteed. Ajani continued, "Don't worry, leave these things to the church. We should give God's servants the opportunity to show themselves." Franz's words made Ajani silent for a while, but she knew very well that once he insisted on his opinion, once he made a decision on something, it meant that everything was within the plan, and there was usually no chance to change it, so there was no need. Let's continue to struggle with this, not to mention that she has other important things to report at the moment. Chapter 308. The road is long and difficult. Archduke Franz, I have some unfortunate news for you. The Brazilians cannot deliver the rubber you ordered on time. The situation in the civil war is very unfavorable to them. The rebels have occupied some rubber producing areas and even cut down rubber trees as food fuel usage point, but we also have a growing gap in the rubber. The production of civilian rubber tires had to be stopped, and materials were concentrated to complete orders for military delivery. Ajani is very worried about this, because a rubber crisis breaks out in Austria almost every year. Although Brazil has been expanding production capacity since 1839, rubber cannot be expanded immediately if you want to expand production capacity. No matter how much money you invest, you still need to wait for it to grow slowly, and this growth is 8 to 10 years in the coming years. The Brazilians only found some wild rubber forests, but the total output did not reach 700 tons. The actual demand for rubber in Austria was more than 1,000 tons per year. The huge gap even made Franz think that the rubber planted in Chandler rubber forests are not enough. It seems that, in order to deliver military orders, Franz can only make pneumatic tires available in advance. But this time Franz was wrong. Although pneumatic tires were a great progress in the history of tires, solid tires were actually better when considering durability alone. Pneumatic tires have better shock resistance and are more labor saving, successfully improving the efficiency of transportation and making riding in a car a pleasure. In fact, before the invention of pneumatic tires, the inside of a carriage was very bumpy. In order to make their rides more comfortable, nobles at that time were often equipped with expensive carriage shock absorbers. Moreover, pneumatic tires are actually more adaptable and maneuverable than solid tires, because solid tires themselves have the characteristics of high elasticity and high wear resistance, which makes them more difficult to control when facing complex roads, and even prone to rollover danger. However, after this operation, the rubber gap in Austria became larger and larger. In order to improve their feelings, dignitaries placed orders for Franz's factory one after another, and some even considered joining the army closer to home. Franz also knew this situation, but the problem of rubber was really unsolvable. In order to solve this situation, he even came up with the idea of synthetic rubber. However, the artificial rubber project has been silent for several years. After all, the front-end technology is far behind, but it has played a role in promoting the development of materials chemistry. All Franz can do now is to further expand the rubber planting area, at least to prepare for the future. At the same time, as electrolysis becomes more and more widely used in industry, the problem of power shortage is becoming more and more serious. Traditional hand crank generators simply cannot meet the growing demand. Franz also invested a lot of money in research, but the result was only a change from hand power to a steam lever, and the efficiency was still very low. But at this time, Nikola Tesla had not yet been born, and the electromagnetic principles that supported him in completing the alternator had not yet been perfected. Franz could only use the stupidest way to increase power. Fortunately, the invention of the steam turbine did not make the cost of electricity too high. Of course, Franz did not reduce his investment in electricity research. After all, the second industrial revolution was the so-called electrical age, and this period was the best opportunity for the Austrian Empire to overtake in a corner afterwards. Ajani reported on some of the latest developments in the Near East. The Ottoman Empire borrowed heavily and seemed to be preparing to rebuild its navy, but it still built traditional wooden sailing battleships, and its artillery was intended to be imported from Britain. But it is worth noting that the wood they used did not come from Russia, but from distant Spain. It is unknown what kind of state relations are revealed, and how many unknown transactions are behind the scenes. The Egyptian Pasha Muhammad Ali abdicated and passed the position of Pasha to his eldest son Ibrahim, and successfully gave up opium. This surprised Franz. However, although Muhammad Ali abdicated and passed the position to Ibrahim, Franz was sure that the hero must be planning something. If he really gave up on himself or looked away, how could he quit opium? Muhammad Ali is indeed a generational hero, but in the current situation, even if he is ambitious, it may be difficult to change the situation. To the west of Egypt, the Karamanli family's control over Tripoli has become increasingly firm. Except for Tunisia, which launched 2 tentative attacks, other countries have not taken any action. However, since the slave trade was banned, Tripoli's economic situation has been very pessimistic. It mainly relies on fishing, dates and wool to make money, and the main trade partner is naturally Austria. However, they did not find oil. Instead, they found many other mineral deposits. However, the infrastructure in Tripoli was extremely backward at this time, and there were no precious metals, so it was worthless to mine. Tunisia feels in crisis. After all, it seems to be the only country around it that still maintains its independence. But the Tunisian monarch named Ahmed Bey, like all the reform-minded monarchs of this era, organized a Western-style army with a number of more than 20,000 people all year round. At the same time, a navy consisting of 18 warships was formed to defend the enemy from the country's borders, but the largest tonnage did not exceed 600 tons, and its firepower was not even as good as the armed merchant ships of the great powers during this period. In the past, Bey did not hesitate to demolish temples in order to reform, burned the religious leaders who opposed him, and even executed his eldest son. But reality gave him a heavy blow, that is, the defeat of Muhammad Ali. Egypt's army and navy were far superior to Tunisia's, but it lost even to the great powers nowadays. Bey goes out in private every day, often makes some strange remarks, and diplomatically sends envoys to Britain, France, Austria, Russia, and Turkey to form alliances everywhere. The domestic opposition to reform was getting louder and louder, but they were brutally suppressed by his new army. In one case, a city with a population of 16,000 was killed until only an old blind man was left. Algeria and Morocco are being invaded by France. Although the French army has won many battles, it has never been able to stabilize the situation. But Algeria and Morocco were also helpless against the French. The casualty ratio was usually more than 7-1. What's more terrible was that France sent warships to blockade the coast, making it impossible for them to continue to purchase weapons from Britain, Austria and other countries. There were even cases where British merchant ships forcibly broke through the blockade and were sunk by French warships afterwards. The British government sent a note to the French ambassador hoping that the other party could give a reasonable explanation. But only one person received a compensation of 100 francs. Faced with the tough attitude of the French, the British government finally had to inform its businessmen not to continue provoking French warships. Of course, this was not what Gizet meant, but what the French military controlled by the Bonapartists meant. They had had enough of the British shamelessness and contempt. This was also recognized by King Louis Philippe, who after all regarded North Africa as his own territory as much as Spain. And now French power has penetrated into Spain, and has even ousted the self-righteous Queen Regent. Chapter 309 Checks and Balances. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz dressed up early, and came to Madame Sophie's palace, but the latter chose to avoid seeing her. People in the palace began to speculate about what the mother and son were up to. The reason was that Franz planned to go sailing with Friedrich and test the performance of the new warship. Of course, this reason was unconvincing to Mrs. Sophie. She felt that the eldest son, who always went his own way, must have taken risks again. Otherwise he would never come to say goodbye to her. But Franz was no longer the child who had just left the children's room. Not only did he have his own ideas and insights, He even cultivated and managed his own power so even the fierce and domineering mother couldn't get over with a spanking, like in the past, so the two sides ended up in a stalemate point. After a cup of tea, Franz got up and left. After all, he had other things to do and didn't have much time to stay here to drink tea. This voyage has been planned, but before Franz leaves, he still needs to entrust his subordinates to deal with matters that check and balance the three biggest unstable factors: Britain, France and the United States. As for what kind of bloody turmoil the three parties will cause in Central and North America, it is none of Austria's business, after all. This was the case in the colonies in the 19th century. Some people would eat one more bite, and some would eat less. Some countries would not be satisfied if they could not have enough food for a long time. Dissatisfaction will cause friction, and escalation will lead to war. Historically, it was not the Monroe Declaration that maintained peace in the Western Hemisphere, but the British Empire's colonial policy in Latin America that allowed the great powers to reach a delicate balance point when the Holy League held a conference in Verona, Austrian Italy in 1822. It authorized France to send troops to suppress the Latin American independence movement in the name of the Holy League. What stopped all this was not the piece of paper, but the powerful ships and cannons of the Anglo-Saxons. Of course, John Bull is not a messenger of justice, and the reason why he does this is not because of the word profit. Looking at Austria's industrial development, which had just started, Franz was troubled by various resource problems and even planned to take risks. Think about Britain as the world's factory. Their demand for raw materials and markets is endless. Latin America had a large amount of exclusive resources and no industrial base, which provided the British with another option: economic colonization. On the one hand, Britain seized a large amount of cheap American resources in the form of loans and aid, and on the other hand, it dumped large quantities of cheap industrial products to America, destroying its economic foundation. The most famous of these is Argentina, which did not repay the money it owed the British until the end of World War II. When the Holy Alliance intended to interfere with the American independence movement, Britain had already established extensive trade ties in the Americas and was in an absolutely dominant position. How could it give up this advantage? The man behind the plan to have the French intervene in the American independence movement was Metternich. This was also the beginning of the diplomatic conflict between Austria and Britain. Some people think that Metternich is just a cross-dressing boss, but this is not the case. This European Prime Minister did carry out a lot of planning, but it is a pity that in view of the weak national power and lack of real rights, he encountered several powerful politicians one after another, which made him somewhat exhausted, but he still brought decades of precious peace to the war-torn European continent. But things are different now. The British's front lines around the world are too long. They have chosen too many places to start the war, and their enemies are countless. The war in Afghanistan has cost Britain £15 million at this time, which is equivalent to the total cost of all British wars after the Napoleonic Wars. Excluding the Turkish-Egyptian War, the UK's cost of the opioid war was only £4.215 million. What's even more terrible is that Russia has not signed the Straits Convention, which means that they still have hegemony over the Black Sea and can shut out the British at any time, directly threatening the interests of the Near East. According to London's estimates, to deal with the Russians they would need at least a 200,000 strong land force, 1/3 of the Royal Navy's strength, and a period of 5 to 10 years to ensure victory in the war. John Taylor of the United States was not an incompetent president. On the contrary, he had been seeking opportunities to drive the British out of Oregon, and he resolutely fought back against the provocations of the Canadian colonial government. At the same time, he increased investment in the Navy and promoted the reform of its military system, accelerating the pace at which a number of battleships were approved for construction. All 3,200-ton Pennsylvania class, the North American politician's set of punches left his northern neighbors at a loss, and they had no choice but to turn to their home country for help. Although the angry British wanted to intervene, due to the opposition of domestic capitalists and the excessively hostile attitude of the United States, They had no choice but to express their helplessness, because at this time, the United States was Britain's largest source of raw materials, and Latin America, which was very inefficient, was completely unable to replace its position. A famous American cotton merchant once said, "As long as American cotton is not delivered to the UK for 3 months, their factories will have to stop production. If it is not shipped to the UK for half a year, the world's #1 position in the textile industry will change. If the supply of American cotton to the UK is stopped for a years, they will kneel down and beg us." In fact, the British also understand this deeply, so they continue to open up new cotton producing areas in order to reduce their dependence on the Americans. Therefore, London had nothing to do against Washington at this time. It could only give a verbal warning, and did not dare to use blockade and embargo measures, because it was no different from sanctioning itself. In addition, Belgium, an emerging industrial country, is also unsettled. They have been flirting with their neighbor France. Of course, the French were not only very happy to see this situation, but even allowed the Belgians to invest and develop in the French colonies. In fact, this is not difficult to understand, because Guizot has always wanted to form a Franco-Belgian alliance and take the opportunity to control the entire lowland area. But the lowlands of the Netherlands were off limits to the British, so when the French proposed building a friendly railway from Paris to Brussels, the British were the first to object. Although the French finally gave in, this also made the British uncomfortable. Austria's expansion in Italy and its attempt to retake Belgrade displeased the British. But in the face of the overwhelming number of global affairs, the number of British officials has always remained only around 3,000. At this time, the number of civil servants in France was as high as 100,000, and in Austria it was close to 80,000. Many people may not understand this concept. To give a simple example, the number of civil servants in the United States will be 19.68 million in 2021, accounting for 6.5% of the US population. At this time, the UK controlled a population of nearly 400 million globally, and its civil servant population accounted for only about 0.00075% of the total population. Therefore, in the face of such a complex international landscape, it could only rely on a large number of temporary workers. As a result, their administrative efficiency can be imagined. Moreover, compared with formal officials, these temporary workers with different backgrounds are more likely to be bribed, and they are also more likely to betray their country's intelligence. It was precisely because of this that Franz knew the British intelligence very well, and made corresponding strategies to counter it. Of course, in addition to Britain's own problems, France reawakened the colonizers' genes after acquiring the Texas colony, which was also an important reason. After all, as long as a hungry wolf has tasted the taste of flesh and blood, he will remember it. Chapter 310 West Borneo, Southeast Asia, Kalimantan. The terrain of this island is typical of high in the middle and low on all sides. The western part is rich in gold, but the local indigenous civilization is relatively backward, and the main minerals are owned by the Chinese who went to Southeast Asia. The overseas Chinese's operation of West Borneo began as early as the Han Wu period, as Emperor Yongle sent Zheng He to the western seas many times. The Chinese's power in Southeast Asia also continued to increase. However, this momentum was interrupted with the beginning of the maritime ban. Until the end of the Ming dynasty, all life was in ruins, China was in ruins, and the people and dignitaries rushed to flee to avoid the disaster of war. The Southeast Asian migration was on the rise again, with approximately 7 million people entering Nanyang to seek a life, a scale far larger than the Irish immigration wave. However, the overseas Chinese were not very united, and were often harassed by the Dutch and Portuguese. During the Qianlong period of the Qing dynasty, Wu Yuansheng, a native of Jiang, Guangdong, fled to Borneo because he was plotting an uprising against the Qing dynasty. He founded the influential Jushan Company there, and became the leader of the company. It was precisely because of the existence of Jushan Company that the status of the Nanyang Chinese was changed. They united the Nanyang Chinese to eliminate gang disputes. Later, in the Battle of Dayang Kingdom, 56 people captured the Dayan Palace, which shocked the entire Kalimantan island. The indigenous sultans the above table begged the Chinese for protection. At this time, most of the Chinese in Nanyang were refugees, the remnants of the Ming army who failed to resist the Qing dynasty, the descendants of the Ming dynasty survivors who were unwilling to serve the Qing court, and members of the Xianda who later failed in the uprising, so their fighting capacity was very strong. Later, the prestige and strength of his subordinate Luo Fangbo gradually surpassed that of Wu Yuansheng. Luo Fangbo replaced him as the leader and established Lanfang Company. Wu Yuansheng became Luo Fangbo's subordinate. Later, Lanfang Company became the Lanfang Republic. At its peak, it controlled the entire island of Kalimantan and was even recognized by the British. I have written down Lanfang's specific political measures in the author's words, but in summary they are 1. Unify currency and market. 2. Reform the military system, develop self-developed weapons, and create a reserve force. 3. Middle school is the body and Western learning is the application. 4. Establish state-owned enterprises and nationalize resources. Unfortunately, by 1842, only 1% of Lanfang's territory remained at its peak, and West Borneo was split into Sanfa, Langfang, and Pontianak, which were managed by 3 companies, San Xiao Gao, Langfang, and Dagan respectively. The masters of Kalimantan were no longer Chinese, but the Dutch and British, and West Borneo was reduced to a semi-colony, led by Capitan appointed by the Dutch. Every year, the Dutch East India Company extracts 15 to 20 million Dutch guilders in profits from West Borneo, and there are only 150 Dutch soldiers stationed here. In addition, the indigenous people who once begged the Chinese for protection have turned into the lackeys of the Dutch. Moreover, these natives are more ferocious than the Dutch. They not only want money, but also food and women. At first, the Chinese could tolerate the appetite of the native sultan. However, as the sultan's appetite grew larger and the income from the gold mine became unstable, the Langfang Company could no longer bear it, and rejected King Wanna's request. Through blackmailing the Chinese over the years, Wanna Tubang is no longer the small tribe that often asks Lanfang to make decisions for them. King Wanna II directly mobilized 20,000 indigenous troops to engage in a fierce battle with Lanfang Company. Due to the obstruction of the Dutch and British, both sides of the war lacked firearms. The main weapons were still broadswords, spears, and bows and arrows. Among them, Lanfang Company has 500 guns. This is where Guliubo's courage lies. Each of these guns costs 200 taels. These 500 weapons, which have long been eliminated from the European battlefield, have cost Lanfang Company a lot. 100,000 taels of snowflake silver. Guliubo was the general manager of Lanfang Company at that time, but what he didn't expect was that King Wanna II's men also had foreign spearmen and even foreign cannons, and they were only more, not less, than him. On February 12, 1842, the first battle between the two sides ended with the Lanfang Company losing 300 soldiers and a mansion. After that, many Chinese enthusiastically joined Lanfang's army to defend their country, but the situation on the battlefield did not change at all. Wherever King Wanna II's troops passed, they would not leave a house, a grain of food, or a living person behind. It seems that the natives are about to rush into Dan Wanlu to steal money, food, and women. At this time, it seemed that there was only one way to go in Guliubo's eyes, and that was to ask the Dutch to mediate. In fact, the Dutch have been prepared for a long time. After all, those natives do not know how to operate gold mines, but they cannot let the Chinese become too powerful. Captain Arjun Pen, who was stationed in West Borneo, had already mobilized 50 soldiers under his command, ready to mediate at any time. However, he suddenly felt that his vision went dark. A huge super battleship sailed into the port, and then one large battleship after another was moored in the port. The leader is the newly built Venetia in Austria. It is a super first-class battleship with 120 guns and a full displacement of 4,700 tons. It still uses sail steam hybrid power. The other 4 are 3,400-ton first-class battleships made in Egypt and modified by Austria, but they are too terrifying compared with the less than 600-ton frigates that the locals deal with all year round. After that, rows and rows of well-equipped soldiers walked out. The laborers and merchants at the port were stunned. A few dozen Dutch soldiers were usually scary enough, This time, thousands of white troops came, and they were really at a loss. Captain Arjen Penge took one look and ran away in fright. The Dutch soldiers behind also fled in panic. 150 Dutch soldiers hid in the fortress and shivered, and even forgot to ask for help from the headquarters on Java Island. Point of course, even if they ask for help from Java Island, no one will come to rescue them. Let alone the Dutch East India Company. Even if all the Dutch warships are gathered together, they cannot defeat Franz's fleet. Point. If the Chandler Church's spy information is correct, then there should still be enough time. What to do with those ants? Friedrich asked. He felt that it would be a loss to come all the way without a fight. You mean those Dutch? As long as they don't take the initiative to provoke, there is no need for us to go to war with them. After all, we are only here to save people, not to fight. Franz shook his head and said he didn't want to make the matter too big. It's easier for them. Friedrich smiled. Point. Just as the people on the dock were looking at each other, a few guys who usually didn't like to talk suddenly straightened their backs and walked towards the white troops. In the surprised eyes of the merchants and workers, they took the white troops on board the ship and headed straight to Dangwanlu. Point. A large number of Western-style troops suddenly appeared on the Dangwanlu battlefield, which made both sides of the battlefield confused, not knowing whether they were enemies or friends. In fact, the Austrian soldiers were also confused, but they didn't care, because they had absolute confidence in their weapons and commander. Franz, who are you going to help? The ones in the city or the ones in the forest? Otherwise, you can clean up everything in one go, so as not to end up like when you were in Togo. Friedrich looked indifferent. As I said, we are here to save people, of course, to help the weak. Franz felt a little speechless about his uncle. He seemed to be too proud. Due to the crushing brought about by technology and weapons, I feel like victory is not worth mentioning. It's barbecue time then. Friedrich snapped his fingers, and rows of rocket launchers were set up. Point. The political system is divided into 5 parts: justice, military, finance, economy, and education. Point. In terms of armaments, ordnance factories are opened, and weapons are cast. Except for a small number of standing troops stationed in strategic military locations, there are no troops stationed elsewhere. In normal times, everyone keeps their own business and selects young people of appropriate age to practice shooting. If something happens, these young people will be recruited to form an army, similar to today's reserve force. In terms of finance, set up tax inspectors to implement tax collection, to replenish the national treasury, collect goods taxes from merchants, and based on the principle of generating income through exports. For example, those who open gold mines have to pay for imitation gold, those who farm have to pay crow's rice cigarette household money, and those who do business also have to pay taxes, and issued its own national currency. Point. Economic aspect: actively expand the market. Minerals are formed into companies by the state, now known as state-owned enterprises, and implemented unified management. Point. In terms of education, run Chinese schools and hire Confucian scholars to teach, focusing on traditional Chinese culture. Point. Judicial aspect: based on the Xiandahu program, Langfang Company annexed the Xiandahu after an arduous military struggle with the Xiandahu, so the relatively systematic and complete program of the Xiandahu was also absorbed by Langfang, and then revised to the popularized Yi acting regulations. In addition to organizing the defense against foreign enemies and collecting taxes, the other main job of officials was to solve cases. Serious crimes required beheading in public, fights required caning, whipping, and quarrels required large red silk candles to apologize. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 311: Victory in the First Battle. Since its debut in West Africa more than a year ago, the Austrian Army's rocket launcher has undergone a round of updates and improvements. The Imperial War Office and the military learned the lessons of actual combat experience. Point. From the summary report submitted by relevant personnel and the Friedrich weapon evaluation log, it is obvious that the weapon's 5-kilometer range is of little importance to the land battlefield. Point. The hit rate in sea battles is too poor, So instead of sacrificing power to increase the attack range, it is better to maximize the three characteristics of shortness, flatness, and speed. Thanks to the efforts of designers, the range of the new rocket in the new round of improvements has been reduced to only 1 kilometer, but its power has nearly doubled, and its launch speed has become faster. Surprisingly, the cost of the new version has not changed much. Just before Friedrich, as the commander-in-chief, ordered all Austrian rockets to be aimed at the troops of the Wanner Kingdom, both the local indigenous people and Lanfang thought that this meant that the Dutch army was coming to seek benefits again. King Wanner too even judged that the Dutch army led by Captain Argent Pen intended to destroy Lanfang in one fell swoop. After all, the former has long had this intention. As long as all the upper-class Chinese forces are eliminated, all the millions of middle-class and lower-class Chinese will become his slaves. After he destroyed the Chinese company, his next target would be the insidious and cunning British, and then he would drive away the Dutch, and then dominate the world. In this careerist perception, the Dutch have the strongest strength, but fortunately their homeland is thousands of miles away, and they are greedy by nature, so it is easy to be bribed. Although the British have some industries in North Borneo, their small number makes them weak. However, due to the geographical constraints, the native king is beyond the reach of the British. The head of Dongguan City. When he saw the Western-style army appearing not far away, Guliubo couldn't help but feel shocked, and the big knife that was already full of gaps in his hand almost fell to the ground. Liu, did you invite those foreigners? Zhigifeng said slowly. At this time, he was already over 70 years old and did not want to get involved in the company's affairs anymore, but at this difficult time, he decided to bring his family members to help guard the situation. Zhigifeng was born as a martial arts scholar, good at using a pair of iron guts, and could shoot 3 bows. He was supposed to become Lanfang's chief commander, but firstly, he had a close relationship with Liu Taiya, and secondly, he had no intention of doing so. Zhigifeng was the great general of Lanfang after the ancient Liu Bo, but he was old and weak, and the situation was declining, so he left Hexi not long after. It's not me. At that time, Liu Taiya spent 200,000 taels of silver, but only hired 200 Dutch soldiers to help him. Now I'm afraid there are thousands of Dutch soldiers, not to mention Wanner bandits. Even if they go to Dongguan, it's still unknown. At that time, no Chinese company in Borneo, except the Dagon Company, had ever defeated the Dutch. But that was also a victory achieved at great cost through an ambush on the premise that the Netherlands had an intelligence advantage. During the period of Liu Taiya, the most cowardly leader of Lanfang Company, 11 Dutch soldiers and an interpreter dared to collect head tax at Lanfang's headquarters. Liu Taiya was the general leader of Lanfang before Guliubo, and it was during his reign that Lanfang began to decline rapidly. One theory is that he was innocent and only signed the sale treaty because he was deceived. But this man was very trustworthy, so he became a Dutch semi-colony. Another theory is that his strength was unstable when he came to power, and he only lured the wolf into the house in order to control the situation. Liu, if you put it like that, we still don't know whether the person coming here is an enemy or a friend. Zhigifeng sighed. He still remembered how prosperous Lanfang Company was when he was young. It is not an exaggeration to describe it as the coming of thousands of nations. Yes, Uncle Z. I'm afraid that this is Dagang, or that Sangao invited us to destroy us. It's also possible that the remnants of the Xiandahu gang from Yusen Company are here. Liu Bo's words resonated with Zhigifeng, and the atmosphere became tense again. On the battlefield. When the Austrian guns turned towards the Wanner natives, Nurazes, the king of Wanner natives, sneered, "Do these guys think we don't have cannons? Show them all, and let them see it." 6 earthen cannons improvised by the Dutch were pushed up, which cost Nurazes 1,000 kilograms of gold in exchange. Although these 6 native cannons have low technological content, they look much more powerful and domineering than the Austrian rocket launchers. At least they look very stocky. Friedrich on the other end couldn't help being shocked when he saw this scene. He put down his telescope and said to Franz next to him, "It seems that this battle is not as easy to fight as we thought." "What is the situation?" Due to the rush, only a vanguard of 1,000 Austrian marines and 50 members of the Chenlaskateri came with the expedition fleet this time, while the large force was still at the seaside. The other side is equipped with artillery. Although it is just an outdated old-fashioned artillery, it may cause some casualties to our side. Franz breathed a sigh of relief and said, "There is no need to worry about a few cannons. That cannot change the situation of the battle. Haha, I thought you were still as unwilling to kill too many people as you were in West Africa. In that case, let's show them our big fireworks first." "That's a rocket," Franz corrected. "It's almost the same. Anyway, it's flying into the sky. Will it explode?" Following Friedrich's order, 20 rocket launchers continued to fly towards King's artillery position at a rate of fire of 6 rounds per minute. These new anti-infantry rodless spinning rockets are equipped with a large number of steel balls inside to increase their power. After the explosion, hundreds of small steel balls will be scattered in all directions. Their maximum killing range is about 50 yards, but the actual effective killing range is 18 yards. Soldiers will be baptized by 120 rounds of these anti-infantry rockets every minute. The lethality of this to the dense formation of the opponent can be imagined. The first ones together were the enemy's elite, that is, the foreign gun team and artillery team. And these unprepared natives wore almost no armor faced with the steel balls that exploded in all directions at high speed. Even the most nimble and agile indigenous soldiers could not avoid them all. Even if there really is a divine warrior, it is impossible for him to be immune to hundreds of barrage attacks. Some indigenous soldiers tried in vain to stop the little devils flying with a blast of air with their hands, but they ended up with the painful price of all their fingers and skin being shaved off. All that was left where they stood was a bloody hole. There were a few people with extremely strong vitality struggling to wriggle on the ground. But as more death from the sky exploded around them, this last struggle soon stopped. Under this saturation attack, soon there was no sign of any living person on the ground except for a pile of bright red corpses. The scene that looked like the end of the world was as if an ancient behemoth had just feasted here. What is sad and ridiculous is that even with such terrifying firepower, the indigenous army did not choose to escape. Instead, they stayed in place like nails and were harvested in pieces so much so that after 5 minutes, the Austrian rocket force had to stop the fire attack to prevent the launcher from being damaged due to long-term and high-intensity use. As the smoke on the other side dissipated, Franz used a telescope to observe that, although the other side had suffered heavy losses, there seemed to be no signs of collapse. This made him very puzzled. According to the common sense of war, if more than 5% of this primitive army, which has not even reached feudalization, is killed in battle, its morale will be gone. But the tragic sight of corpses on the ground didn't seem to frighten the other party. Could it be that they still have backup? There are more than 2 million indigenous people living in the land of West Borneo, so it is not impossible to organize 100,000 to 200,000 combatable troops at once. It seems that the weapons and troops brought by our side in this operation are a bit too thin. If we had known this, we should have sent our elite dragoon regiment to help. However, because the complex terrain and climate of the tropics are very unsuitable for cavalry operations in temperate zones, only a group of marines and a small number of hunters can be used. While Franz was thoughtful, Friedrich had already ordered the Austrian soldiers to line up to prepare to face the enemy. They were all equipped with the latest breech loading rifled guns, but it was a pity that they were too short to dig trenches. Otherwise he really wanted to test the new tactics. Just as the officers on the Austrian side were arranging their troops intensively, a heart-rending howl suddenly rang out from the calm battlefield. Coupled with the red earth, it was like a Shura field-like picture. The few indigenous people who survived desperately fled back to the mountains and forests. Perhaps only the mountain gods could save them from this horrific killing. Shields, weapons, and armor were scattered all over the place. Everyone had only one goal, and that was to escape. Even if the person standing in front of him is a brother or a father and son, he will kill anyone who dares to block the way. Nuraz is his father. Rolazes was described as the dog of the Tang people because he would only rely on the power of the Tang people to fight for some land that others did not want, or to collect some garbage that other tribes did not want. People who are disabled or thin. Nurazes took over the power of the tribe at the age of 16 and then began his brutal path to power. He first killed 7 of his brothers and sisters, and then began a bloody conquest that lasted 20 years. After decades of foreign wars, the population and territory of the Warner Kingdom have more than doubled. They even received support from the Dutch before. It can be said that he is only the last step away from the success of his dream point, but this one-sided war robbed Naraz of all his ambitions and his soul. He didn't rush into the jungle like other tribe members or push down and trample his companions, but when a self-proclaimed ruler loses his ambition to conquer the world, he is no different from his subordinates, who just want to escape. Chapter 312 Unexpected. Friedrich did not order a pursuit, because Franz had taught him countless times about the horrors of jungle warfare during the 3-month voyage. The negative example is of course the US military. After all, they are the ones who fall the hardest in the jungle. At this time, the Austrian army did not have a numerical advantage. The reason why it was able to beat the opponent was entirely due to the crushing technology and the inhumane and indiscriminate bombardment of Franz Trench. In 5 minutes, half of Franz's rockets were knocked out. Of course, the achievement of such great results was also due to the fact that the indigenous people had never seen this kind of weapon, and they formed a dense formation. They even wore decent armor, and did not seek cover. In fact, due to the limitations of the power of gunpowder at that time, even a wooden shield covered with animal skin could provide good protection against those shooting steel balls. After those steel balls penetrate the shield, there is not much kinetic energy. At this time, if you put a piece of leather armor inside, you will only suffer some minor injuries. At least it wouldn't be like the pile of rotten flesh lying on the ground right now, with no possibility of treatment. However, not to mention shields and leather armor, these indigenous people don't have much cloth. Most of them are topless. Of course, this is also related to the local climate, which is humid and hot. Jungle warfare has always been a headache. In this case, the advantages of technology, tactics, and personnel quality will be greatly reduced. The results of countless wars in history tell everyone that jungle warfare relies on familiarity and adaptability to the local environment. The side that is more familiar with the local environment can always gain a huge advantage. The terrain, landforms, plants, climate, organisms, and roads are all important. Could be part of that advantage. For the unfamiliar party, these are all obstacles and even fatal. Franz didn't want to bet on this kind of thing, and there was no need to bet. What he was thinking about now was how to appease the restless people in the city, how to take over this area, and get them on the right path. For this reason, Franz made a special trip to Rome before coming. He bought the letter asking for help written by Emperor Yangli of the Southern Ming dynasty to the Pope for 5,000 florins. He also obtained several authorization letters and spent a total of 30,000 florins. At this time, Pope Gregory XVI was good at this. As long as he had money, he would do things and everything could be clearly marked with a price. In the eyes of the Pope, this letter asking for help and several authorization letters of unknown use were like waste paper, not even as good as the indulgences written by him himself. Moreover, the reactionary rule of the Pope in Rome also relied on the Austrian Empire, the guardian of Catholicism. Naturally, he had no reason not to sell Franz's face. Franz also asked Dayan Shanayan to embroider a large flag on his way here, which happened to be useful at this time. In fact, Friedrich and many Austrian officers were skeptical of Franz's plan. They felt that it was unrealistic to rely on a flag to avoid a fierce battle. But the flag was still raised according to Franz's instructions. The head of Dongguanlu city. The leaders of Lan Fang Company were shocked by the short but efficient massacre just now. Fighting, non-existent. It's literally a battle between adults and babies. Uncle Z, what kind of army is this? Were you confident of dealing with them when you were young? Uncle Gueliu was already sweating profusely. He didn't know whether it was the hot weather or the terrifying pressure brought by the army in front of him. Zigifeng said with a bitter smile, the general system has promoted me, not to mention that I'm a small martial arts scholar. Even if the martial arts champion comes, I will probably die. Giffen was already famous back then, and joining Lan Fang was a perfect match. When she was young, she was known as an invincible fighter in Southeast Asia. But at this time, even Mr. Z said there was nothing he could do, and the leaders of Lan Fang Company suddenly felt a little discouraged. Suddenly someone said, what should we do if they attack the city? Everyone was silent, because based on the combat effectiveness this army had shown before, it would be easy to break through the city wall of Dongguanlu Point at this time. The soldiers responsible for guarding the city would probably be beaten into a ball of rotten flesh like the natives. At that time, all the people in Dongguanlu City will be prey point at this time, someone said again. Strange, those people didn't seem to be Dutch soldiers. They took out a flag. What is that? Franz felt that by playing the banner of the Ming dynasty, he would definitely be able to impress the Chinese people in the city. When the time came, he would take the Imperial edict and the fake jade seal from the Nanming emperor and say that the Habsburgs, who were the enemies of the Ming dynasty, had taken over and should be able to win over all the people. Most people's hearts are that after all, the predecessor of Jushan Company is Xiandahu Point. Soon the city was filled with people, beating gongs and drums and shouting loudly. Wow. Is this broken flag really so useful? Friedrich and a group of Austrian officers were very surprised. Although they did not believe what Franz said, they still hoped to win without a fight. After all, Franz did not like plundering. Only Franz's face was solemn, because he heard what the people on the wall were shouting. Ming, it's the remnants of the previous Ming dynasty. You can't live as a King dynasty person, and you can't die as a King dynasty soul. Mr. Luo Fangbo was loyal to the imperial court all his life, and even when he died, he still stood facing the north. Our descendants must not let down the emperor's grace. Today is the day to kill thieves and serve the country. Folks, come on me, damn king. Retreat. Franz snorted 2 words from his nose. Retreat? Aren't they here to welcome us? Friedrich asked. Those who came to kill us set off smoke bombs. If we don't leave, it will be too late. Franz's tone was cold, and it could be heard that it was filled with murderous intent. Although Friedrich didn't know what happened, he still ordered a retreat. After all, Franz's judgment was always correct. The gate of Dongguanlu City opened wide, and countless civilians poured out like a tide, and the sound of killing was loud. But as dozens of smoke bombs exploded in front of the door, the steps of the civilians were delayed. At this time, a sound came from far away. This smoke is poisonous. The crowd hurriedly retreated into the city. Damn. The remnants of the Kan Ming dynasty, they actually let out poisonous smoke. Hurry up and use baby urine. It can still stop foreign bullets. When the smoke slowly dissipated, the battlefield was empty. It was as if the army had never been there, but the corpses that exuded a fishy smell were still there in the direction of the jungle. What happened? It's a ghost soldier. The traitor against the Ming dynasty used evil methods. Everyone, listen to me. Watering the city wall with black dog blood can prevent the evil thieves from using evil methods. Every household should prepare children's urine to prevent the evil spirits from coming again. Go. Liu Bo commanded the people in Dongguanlu City to strengthen the city defense. Although the natives were repulsed, something more terrifying than the natives appeared, and it seemed that they could not relax at all. Franz sat on the boat back and was sulking alone. He did not expect that these people who were alone overseas still considered themselves king people. In fact, what Franz didn't know was that Jushan Company, which first took root in Lanfang, was indeed an industry of Xiandahu. However, after Luo Fangbo took over, he carried out several years of decentralization of Xiandahu and drove the Xiandahu element out of Lanfang. Fang Company. In history, Lanfang Company had many wars with the Xiandahu organization in Nanyang. Although they defeated the Xiandahu, they also used harsh words to deal with them, saying that they would definitely come back for revenge. In order to maintain its orthodox status, Lanfang Company applied for a seal from the Qing dynasty, and even demonized Xiandahu and Kunming. Therefore, when people in Dongguanlu see the Ming dynasty flag, they can inspire strong fighting spirit. As for the Xiandhui, they later established Yusun Company in Pontianak and other places. Although they were called Yusun Company, it was actually more appropriate to call them Yusun Company. But the story doesn't end like this today. Pontianak and other places. Although they were called Yusun Company, it was actually more appropriate to call them Yusun Tong, because they did not look like a company, but more like a gang. But in today's battle, Franz also saw that these people were either unable to protect themselves, or did not have a common goal and program. If they could be as brave as fighting Franz every time they fought, Lanfang would have unified Nanyang long ago. But the story doesn't end like this today. I added 1,400 words, which is almost a chapter. Chapter 313, an unexpected gain. Austrian warships came in a hurry and left in a hurry. But no matter what, the Dutch army hiding in the fortress breathed a sigh of relief. If the Austrians' goal was to land on the island and seize the island, then they would have only one option: surrender aboard the super first-class battleship Venetia. If you have any crooked ideas in your unusual brain, tell me. If you find this sea journey boring, we can also take a trip to Hue. Last time I was in the square of the vast palace of the Vietnamese emperor. After walking around, it's a great place to play football, Friedrich exclaimed. Play football? Franz asked curiously. Yes, this is also thanks to you and Miss Agani. Now this sport is very popular among soldiers in the army. Of course, compared to competing in person, Friedrich, a former commander, preferred to watch the battle from the sidelines and show off his ability to study tactics. In addition, the reason why the royal palace in Hue became suitable for football was not the result of Friedrich's indiscriminate bombing of the city of Hue. After the Austrian troops withdrew, the fire in Hue burned for another 3 days and 3 nights. Uncle Friedrich, have you forgotten that we have an armistice agreement? You should keep a low profile at this time, instead of going to other people's palaces to show off your power. If you can't help it, wait a few years before going. It's not too late. There is no need to push Vietnam too hard at this time. It is better to wait for the other side to collapse internally before taking action. But Friedrich's remarks still make sense. This trip cannot be returned empty-handed. However, the current Nanyang has basically been divided up. Singapore and Myanmar belong to the British, southeastern Indonesia and Java belong to the Netherlands, and the Philippines belongs to Spain. Even on the island of Kalimantan, there are 4 forces that are intertwined. The only ones that have not been completely invaded are Siam, Vietnam, and Laos. However, Laos was first eliminated because it was too far from the coast and had inconvenient transportation. France would not do it like the Italians did, overhauling railways in the colonies, emptying the treasury, and finally handing it over to others for Vietnam. Due to the duration of the armistice agreement and the remaining resistance, forced occupation would outweigh the gains and losses, and would attract the covetousness of other powers. Of course, this mainly refers to France. They sent a large number of spies, missionaries, and even merchants to Vietnam to trade with Vietnam. In addition, the French provided weapons and instructors to the Nguyen dynasty, hoping that they could drive the Austrians out of Vietnam. Of course, the French are not really kind. They are just preparing for the invasion of Vietnam. If the Vietnamese can have another battle with Austria, it would be best for them to take advantage of it. Then the only option left for the Austrian Empire was Siam. However, the wise Rama III is very cooperative. He has offered to help Austria more than once. But if large-scale planting is carried out in Thailand, Austria may lose its exclusive advantage in rubber resources. However, this is of little significance. Not to mention that the cunning British would choose to secretly test seeds in other colonies. Brazil's ever-changing domestic political situation also caused it to not fully implement and comply with the agreement. Moreover, as far as the current situation is concerned, the biggest beneficiary of expanding rubber production is the Austrian Empire, because its industry has begun to take shape due to the advantage of starting early. 3 days later, Siam, Bangkok. The warships flying the yellow and black Imperial flag slowly sailed into the port. Even the Siamese, who were used to seeing Western-style battleships, were attracted by the Venetia as a super first-class battleship. They had never seen such a huge one-warship. The ship had just anchored, and the Siamese officials, who had been waiting on the dock for a long time with a group of coolies, asked the officers above if they needed help. After the two parties agreed on the price, labor coolies boarded the ship to unload the goods. What surprised visitors from afar was that not only the officials, but also the foremen were quite a few who could speak German. Did we go to the wrong place? If it weren't for the help of a map and compass, I would have thought we were in Kampong Som, Friedrich said jokingly. No, it seems that the king of Siam is not simple. Franz said sincerely that he understands the difficulty of survival for small and weak countries. Friedrich looked around and snorted. Really? This is simply an undefended port. If the main fleet of the empire is present, this city will be razed to the ground in one day. Sometimes, I really don't understand your warlike heart. Why do you resort to force when things can be solved politically and economically? Furthermore, the port with piles of ruins has lost its own value. Besides, other powers will agree. Franz was very speechless and then stopped a little girl who looked like she was working hard with a fruit basket on her head. He bought a fruit basket with a gold coin, picked up a durian, and broke it open with his hands. His unintentional movement made Yan Shanayan on the side exclaim in surprise, and Friedrich also widened his eyes in disbelief. How did you do that? The latter exclaimed in surprise. Your Highness, the smell of this thing is really unbearable. It is probably poison. For the sake of your health, throw it away. Yan Shanayan said, while fanning the smell from the tip of his nose. Franz had no choice but to throw the durian aside, then turned to Friedrich and asked, do you want to learn? I have no interest in becoming a victim of such a strong smelling weapon. Okay, then, let's get down to business. At this time, Oshio Shanayan pulled the corner of Franz's clothes. The latter followed the direction pointed by the former and saw the little girl who had just sold the fruit and was about to go home. It seemed that she was in a little trouble. It must be a gold coin. Trouble caused, Uncle Friedrich, please send a company to follow me. I need to deal with something. In fact, during this trip, Franz was accompanied by a small team of personal guards. But it's a new arrival, and I'm not familiar with the local environment at all, so for safety's sake it's better to bring more with you. After all, even the so-called saints make mistakes sometimes, not to mention that he just stumbled in Borneo, so he must not be careless. Next, surrounded by more than 100 heavily armed strong men, Franz turned into the alley. The scene inside was naturally a scene of several gangsters robbing a little girl. When these guys who bullied the weak and feared the strong were stunned when they saw more than 100 soldiers in neat uniforms pouring into the alley. Then a great drama of a saint descending from the sky to help others was staged. Oshio Shanayan took advantage of this free time to quietly pull the little girl away from the center of the conflict, preparing to ask about her family situation and give her family a sum of money to let them leave this place of right and wrong. After all, it all started because of Franz. Whether it was out of good intentions or not, this little girl got involved in unnecessary right and wrong. Although he can help out now, the final result of chivalry and righteousness still depends on it. If those gangsters continue to cause trouble for her and her family after he leaves, then he will be harming her. So Franz, who didn't want to be punished by his conscience, was ready to spend a sum of money to end it all. But the answer Oshio Shanayan got was that this little girl was actually an orphan. After asking for his opinion, she took the little girl named Yakunda with her, but this did not arouse Franz too much interest. Soon after this episode ended, Franz and Friedrich had an opportunity to meet the King of Siam. According to common practice in Siam, envoys who want to meet their monarch need to go through layers of approval and a long wait. Just when Siam officials were lamenting the strength of the neighboring country's sovereign, an entire fleet flying the Austrian flag sailed into the harbor. The sails that blocked the sky made the Siamese officials at the port break out in cold sweat. The ZUO Molling, a secret service agency similar to the Royal Guards, who was responsible for investigating the authenticity of the Austrian envoys, even ran back to the palace crawling on the ground. Rama III knew how to survive as a small country. Although Siam was a hegemon in the Indochina Peninsula, it was nothing more than a joke in the eyes of the powerful Central Plains dynasty and the great powers that came across the sea. After all, Siam at this time couldn't even deal with those fanatical Chenlaskatarii, let alone their masters. This time, the Austrian expeditionary fleet was even more powerful than ever before. Of course, what surprised him most was that the visiting envoys turned out to be two members of the royal family. Rama III, who had never seen a member of the European royal family, was full of curiosity. Do they have 4 eyes and 3 legs? The splendor of the Siam Palace complex blinded Friedrich. Of course he did not know that, although the Siam Palace in history was not much better than the Phnom Penh Palace in Cambodia and the Hue Palace in Vietnam. Its special feature was this is the only royal palace that has not been baptized by war. He was fascinated by the towering trees and Chinese style buildings around him. This kind of majesty is completely different from the feeling brought by ordinary European style buildings nowadays. It is more like the feeling he had when he saw the city walls of Constantinople for the first time. A heavy sense of history came to his face, making him feel he had an urge to conquer this place. But Franz, who lived in China in his previous life, and Oshiyasujin, who is more familiar with East Asian palaces, have no feeling at all. On the other hand, little Yakunda felt as if he had entered the Grand View Garden, feeling curious and scared at the same time. Rama III was sitting on the throne of his palace, waiting for the arrival of Franz and his party, while listening to the reports of his ministers. What are their movements and whereabouts these days, Your Majesty? Those Austrians taught a few gangsters on the dock a lesson. Rama III couldn't help but sigh. Really? I didn't expect the gangsters to be so brave now. My generals were frightened by the Austrian warships. However, the monarch did not show a look of surprise on his face, but continued to ask calmly, is there any more? They also took away a little girl along the way. The minister replied respectfully. After hearing this, the corner of Rama III's mouth curled up. Sure enough, people can be bribed if they have desires, even enemies. Bring all the beautiful girls you selected earlier into the palace. Those distinguished guests from far away may need them. The Siamese palace eunuch naturally understood what the king meant and immediately went down to prepare. An hour later, the main hall of the palace. Franz and Friedrich met the legendary Rama III. Because they did not understand Siamese, the language talents of these two people were of no use. They originally wanted to ask Dayan Shanayan to help translate, but according to the summoned eunuch, Rama III had already learned German. So he gave up. In the main hall, the two sides looked at each other. Rama III's initial impression was that Austria might be the legendary Lilliputian country, and the two royal families seemed to be not as tall as himself. Franz 150 centimeters. Friedrich 158 centimeters, Rama III 160 centimeters. In fact, this kind of looking up and down is a very rude behavior, but it is acquiesced by both parties. Friedrich thought that the fat man on the throne was more like a shopkeeper selling groceries, and did not take him seriously. Franz's first impression of the monarch in front of him was not good. His routine fake smile and the presence of a bunch of ugly people made him feel chilled. However, this does not mean that the subsequent agreement negotiations between the two parties ended successfully in a friendly atmosphere. With a stroke of his pen, King Rama III decided to set aside 10,000 acres of land for development and planting of rubber. His original intention was to cater to the Austrian Empire, but what he didn't expect was that the other party put forward the condition that the sales price should not be lower than 1,000 florins per ton. The market price at this time is 500 florins per ton. However, this small amount of money did not make Rama III take it too seriously. He just felt that Franz seemed to be slightly different from other powers. The attentive King Rama III could see that the other party did not seem to be interested in the elaborate gifts he had prepared, so he asked the women to withdraw from the hall. After that, the two sides had a very awkward and businesslike exchange of blows. Before leaving, Franz suggested, Your Majesty, I have one more request, please. Tell me, Prince Franz. Rama III couldn't tell the difference between Austrian nobles. I met an orphan in your port and felt very pitiful. I hope that His Majesty the King can take him in. Oh, the orphans in our country are all my subjects, so of course they are my responsibilities. However, the king sneered in his heart. This foreigner is really unreasonable. He actually let someone raise a woman for him. Of course Franz would not know his psychological activities. He just handed over the little girl named Akunda to the other party. Franz felt that he had finally ended a bad relationship, but what he didn't expect was that it would turn into an even bigger bad relationship. More than 10 years later, after the trip to the palace, Franz and Friedrich returned to the battleship carrying a batch of gifts from the King of Siam. In any case, this harvest made everyone temporarily forget about the unpleasant trip to Borneo. 10,000 acres of rubber forest may seem like a lot, but in fact, the output after rubber tapping started was only about 650 tons, which is a drop in the bucket for the exaggerated growth rate of the Austrian rubber industry, and it will take another 8 years for a good harvest. It's just that it seems a little early for a fleet of this size. to go to Japan, to carry out a black ship incident. In advance. Just when Franz thought everything had settled, things took a turn for the better again. When the ship was about to enter the Strait of Malacca, a fearless small boat came directly towards the battleship Venetia. However, it was naturally impossible to force the moving battleship to stop. There was only a crisp sound, and the boat broke into pieces. Although Franz and Friedrich did not know what the other party's purpose was, they decided to organize the officers and soldiers on the ship to rescue the people who fell into the water first. Soon a wet Oriental woman was pulled up, but she no longer cared about that. "Ah, you here for me, the Ming dynasty? I'm Zhu Qiangying, the legitimate daughter of the Zhu Ming dynasty. Where is the Yi chief?" A 4,000 word chapter. Chapter 349. The Zhu family of Ming dynasty give money. Additional update. Of course, only Franz, Dayan Shanayan and a few Skitarii spies on the entire ship could understand Zhu Qiangying's words. Although the other person's expression was serious, Franz couldn't help laughing. Suddenly I thought of the scam text messages from later generations. "Hello, I'm Emperor Hanwu. Now you only need to reward me with 20,000 starting coins, and I can be resurrected. After I successfully restore the country, I will remember you a great achievement, and I will allow you to split the earth, and become the king, and have a dinner at Jaya's house." It didn't matter to Franz whether the Zhu Qiangying in front of him was real or fake, but this woman did arouse his interest. Others around him didn't quite understand why Franz was talking to himself at one moment and laughing out loud at the other. Dayan Shanayan could understand the situation at hand. Archduke Franz must have thought of something, and it was related to the person in front of him who claimed to be the princess of Ming dynasty. She glanced at Franz, who nodded. "Mr. Parrish, please bring that lady over." Parrish grabbed Zhu Qiangying's arm and prepared to bring her to the two Grand Dukes. But the latter forcefully shook off Parrish's hand and said stubbornly, "I will go on my own." Parrish was originally a royal guard, and now he has become one of the guard captains of Archduke Franz. His duty is to protect Franz's safety, but he will not show mercy to the foreign woman in front of him. Seeing that a big slap like a cattail fan was about to fall on Zhu Qiangying's face, Franz had no choice but to shoot into the sky. "Let her come here." Franz's order was still very effective, but the sailors walking on the deck also became serious. Soon a road appeared in front of Zhu Qiangying, with fully armed soldiers on both sides, all of them looking like they were ready. The murderer saw made Zhu Qiangying feel the pressure doubled, and her breathing became heavy. At this time, the two groups of soldiers raised their spears, and each two spears were intertwined to form a channel built with bayonets. The neat voices, neat movements, and the aura of looking down on the world made Zhu Qiangying feel shocked again. This is a guard trained by Franz. It is completely trained according to the specifications of the National Honor Guard of later generations. The difference is that these people have blood on their hands, so their momentum is completely different. Seeing them at close range is scary. Wetting your pants is also normal. The distance of dozens of steps in front of her was the most difficult road Zhu Qiangying had ever walked in her life. Since she didn't understand German and didn't know what was going on, she could only take a gamble based on her own judgment. Zhu Qiangying chose to walk with her head held high. Although cold sweat had soaked her clothes, she tried her best to look normal and not show any timidity. It only took Zhu Qiangying more than 10 seconds to walk through the forest of guns, but she felt as if her heartbeat had stopped for 10 seconds, and what Zhu Qiangying saw next refreshed her outlook once again. The person sitting on the main seat is a young man, and the one chatting and laughing next to him is also a young man. In addition to a few powerful guards, there is even a nation face standing next to him. He should be a woman of about the same age as himself. The child was wearing a white navy uniform. Before Oshio Shanayan arrived, Franz asked her to change her original clothes, and she was not allowed to speak Japanese. After all, Japanese pirates were not welcome. As for wearing a navy uniform, it was Franz's personal interest. Suddenly there was a burst of applause, and the person applauding was the young man sitting in the main seat. "Miss Zhu Qiangying, you are very brave, but I think you need a chair at this time, right?" The pronunciation of this word made Zhu Qiangying almost unable to believe her ears. It was clearly a Western boy in front of her, but she was speaking in Chinese. After was briefly absent-minded, Zhu Qiangying immediately woke up and said, "Then please give me a seat." Someone soon brought her chair to Zhu Qiangying. After she sat down, she thought to herself, "Who is the young man in front of me? Hello, please allow me to introduce myself. We come from the Austrian Empire in Europe. My name is Franz Joseph von Habsburg. This is my uncle, Friedrich Ferdinand Leopold von Habsburg. We are here to help Emperor Yangli of the Southern Ming Dynasty." Although Zhu Qiangying, who has been living in Southeast Asia for many years, does not know the Habsburg family, she can analyze from their names that the two teenagers belong to the same family. But before Zhu Qiangying could speak, Franz said, "Then, I want to know, which Ming Dynasty clan are you the legitimate daughter of?" As far as Franz knew, the wild boar skin had completely wiped out the Ming Dynasty clan. Of course, in addition to the Manchus, Li Zicheng and Zhang Xianshang also contributed a lot. So back to the topic. Franz was curious about what the woman in front of him was going to say. "I am Emperor Jianwen, the 26th grandson of Zhu Yunwen, Zhu Qiangying. Haha. Not bad. Not bad." Franz clapped and laughed again. He really didn't expect that the deal would be directly blamed on the missing Emperor Jianwen, Zhu Yunwen. But this is the real death without evidence. After all, it happened 500 years ago. Zhu Qiangying bit her lip. She knew that the other party didn't believe her, but she had to go on with this scene. "Do you have proof?" Franz continued. "There are genealogy and national jade seals as evidence." Zhu Qiangying said lightly. At this time, she took out an ancient scroll and an exquisite box from her clothes. Of course, because it had been soaked in water, the scroll was blurred beyond recognition. In fact, Franz was shocked when he heard about the jade seal of Chuanjiuo. After all, according to unofficial records, Zhu Yunwen took away the jade seal of Chuanjiuo, which caused Emperor Yangli to have a hard time searching for it, but he still couldn't find it until his death. At this time, Zhu Qiangying was crying so hard that she must be regretful because of the loss of her family tree. Franz opened the box containing the jade seal. The jade seal was already in tatters, and the material of the jade seal was hard to describe. It suddenly shattered when Franz was about to put it back. Zhu Qiangying, who was sitting opposite, suddenly showed a very shocked expression. Before she could say anything, Franz pushed a big box over. "Open the box and pick one you like," Franz said with a slight smile. Zhu Qiangying's eyes were already red, but she still opened the box. Suddenly she was stunned by the sight in front of her. There were dozens of jade seals of various sizes inside. In fact, the price of jade in Europe at this time was very low, and few people liked to collect it. Franz collected a large number of high-quality jade materials from Russia, Chile and other places, and specially carved a batch of jade seals, thinking that he might use them in the future. Have a useful day. Finally, Zhu Qiangying couldn't stand the continuous mental stimulation and passed out. "Send her to my room." Franz said something and prepared to leave, but was blocked by Friedrich. "Hey, what did you whisper to people?" And they were so stunned. "Why did you bring people into your room now?" Friedrich said with a smirk on his face. "I can send her to your room, but this princess always needs someone to take care of her. Do you want to take care of her?" Franz looked indifferent, because except for Daoyan Shanayan and Zhu Qiangying, there were no other women on the warship. He didn't know what would happen if they were placed elsewhere. Chapter 315. Some are happy, some are sad. Kalimantan, East Vanlet. In the Lanfang Chui Hall, Captain Arian Peng picked up a pipe, but deliberately did not take out a match. There was a smart young man next to Uncle Gu Liu, the general manager of Lanfang. He immediately took out a box of matches, and the match was lit with a click. He carefully held it in the palm of his hand and lit a cigarette for Captain Arjun Pen. But he never thought that Captain Arjun Pen would kick the young man in the stomach. The kick did not retract, causing the latter to suffer from severe pain. "Do you have any dissatisfaction, sir? Let me light your cigarette first." Guliubo directly stepped over the young man who fell to the ground. Still showing a respectful look, the captain raised his head and glanced around the lobby. I don't want you to light a cigarette for me. I want her to come. At this time, Guliubo looked embarrassed because the person chosen by the other party was Song Kibo's granddaughter, who was also his recent daughter-in-law. Lanfang Company has been declining in recent years and has had to resort to internal marriages to consolidate its power. Well, Sir Arian, please take this girl off for my sake. She is the old man's unmarried daughter-in-law. Gu. Liubo had a flattering look, thinking that he was a captain after all, and should be a bit thin-faced. You old thing. Do I agree to your son's marriage? The captain's arrogant attitude made Guliubo's son, Gu Shishan, want to rush over and chop up the red-haired ghost, but was stopped by his father-in-law. A little impatience will ruin a big plan, Xiangsu. On the other hand, Guliubo, who was angry in his heart, still put on a smile and gave himself a big slap in the mouth. Look, my memory. Immediately, Guliubo took it out from his arms, and the atmosphere suddenly became tense. Even Arian Pen was so frightened that he sat upright. Uncle Gugu, I'm warning you, our Dutch East India Company still has 10,000 mercenaries in Batavia. At this time, Guliubo took out a gold sticker and 2 gold bars from his arms and handed them to the horrified opponent. This is for you. Please bear with me. Arian Pen returned to his usual stinky face after seeing the gold and continued. Stop smoking and let's get down to business. You said it. You said it. I can't pretend I didn't see you arbitrarily starting a war with the Wana Kingdom. Pen said unhurriedly. It was King Wana II who started it. Many of our brothers died at his hands. Countless civilians were killed and injured, and the mansion was burned down. I don't care. Now the headquarters is calling for peace, and you crippled those natives. Who will pay our taxes? This year, your Lanfang tax will be increased by 2 levels. Mr. Liang, we really have no money. Please give us a few more kind words. Guliubo said. No money? What is this without money? Pen sneered, took out the 2 gold bars and waved them in front of Uncle Guliu, then stuffed them into his pocket, then put his hat on his head and strode out. I'm telling you, if you can't pay your taxes, you won't be able to smoke anymore. Uncle Guliu had no choice but to lead the crowd to kneel on the ground and try to block Captain Arian Pen's way, but the latter left without looking. In the end, Guliubo could only hold back a translator named Kyan-san. Master Kyan, you can't ignore us. We are all citizens of the Qing dynasty. Kyan-san was originally a miner in Lanfang, but because he was injured while competing for minerals with other companies, instead of receiving compensation and treatment from the company, he was even left to fend for himself near Crocodile Beach Point. But he didn't expect that Kyan-san's life should be cut off. A group of missionaries happened to pass by and rescued him. Later, he learned Dutch as a blessing in disguise, and through his own efforts, he became a commissioner of the Dutch East India Company, specializing in Chinese affairs on the island of Kalimantan. Even Arjun Penge, an authentic Dutchman, has to pay 3 respects to him. Kyan-san didn't have any feelings for Lanfang and said casually, send that girl to the fortress tonight, and I'll help you think of a solution. Seeing Guliubo's hesitation, Kyan-san just sneered and walked away. Third master. At this time, Guliubo felt physically and mentally exhausted. He had spent so much money and spent so many years to finally climb to this position. He originally thought that he could make a fortune and return to his country to spend his remaining years in peace, but who would have thought that this would be the case? At the ending, I couldn't help but sigh. Different from the sadness of Lanfang Company, the Sanxiaogao Company and Dagon Company next door were so happy that they couldn't sleep all night when they heard that the Dutch were going to increase Lanfang's taxes. The brothels, casinos, and tobacco pipes were all brightly lit. In the main hall of Cheyenne Company, Cheyenne, which had been marginalized, the 4 leaders gathered again after many years. Isn't this hall Master Zhang of Zuanwu Hall? Your black goods business is really getting better and better. Where? The British are not easy to fool. When it comes to making money, who doesn't know that your Beikutang's brothel and casino can make tens of thousands of dollars a day? When it comes to making money, you have to look at the Zouk Hall. The firearms they obtained from the foreign devils are a huge profit. Is that what I said? Hall Master Liu. At this time, Zhao Xiannian, the master of Qinglang Hall, walked in, followed by 2 light coughs. I said, "Old guys, you have done well over the years. Thank you, big brother, for taking care of me." The 3 hall masters responded in unison. Back then, the head of the hall was killed by someone named Luo, so our brothers had to start a new business. But God had a vision, and Lan Fang had no successor. Not only did he become a lackey of the Dutch, he was even oppressed by the natives. I think back then, the surnamed master, Zheng Chenggong, beat these red and yellow haired dogs, and begged for mercy, but these pure dogs were willing to be slaves. It is really disgusting. Brothers, Emperor Yangli's letter asking for help finally arrived in Europe. The heavenly troops of the Imperial court have arrived, and the day to restore our Han family's mountains and rivers is coming. Although Zhao Xiannian, the leader of Qinglang Hall, spoke with great energy, the other 3 leaders only thought of him as the eldest brother, and went crazy again. After all, after Jushan Company became Lanfang Company, this eldest brother had engraved on his body the restoration of our country in the fight against the Qing dynasty and the Ming dynasty. That's not normal. Hall Master Wu was right when he said that fighting against the Qing dynasty and restoring the Ming dynasty was just a slogan, and there was no need to take it too seriously. Just like a monk reciting Amitabha, power and money are real, and everything else is just a cloud. Seeing the lack of interest among his old brothers, Zhao Xiannian couldn't help but talk about his experience of the detailed work he had arranged in Danwanlu. Brother, don't be ridiculous. Brothers all know that you are a loyal minister of the Han family. But how can you kill 3,000 indigenous soldiers with 1 shot and be driven away by Lanfang's bastards? This is simply bragging. Zouk Hall Master Liu said, "Yes, brother. If the heavenly soldiers of the Imperial court are like the rumors, they come and go without a trace, they can fly in the clouds, and they can capture people's hearts. Why are they still helping those Tatalakis to fight?" Hall Master Zhang of Zuanwu Hall said, "Yeah, why didn't they just rush into Danwanlu and kill those dog Tatars? I think it's probably the foreign gun team invited by Lanfang Company. Only the Dutch have this ability," said the leader who of the White Tiger Hall. Chapter 316. If you receive orders from heaven, you will live a long and prosperous life. There was a lot of discussion in the main hall of Hessian Company, but there was a sudden commotion outside the hall. It's not good. Something bad is happening. The voice came to the hall before Marseille's people arrived. Then someone ran in a panic. This was the territory of UMW Company and the headquarters of the Nanyang Xiandi Society. Zhao Xiannian still behaved very calmly. "Why are you panicking? What the hell is going on?" Zhao Xiannian's scolding made the minion wake up a little, and he quickly answered, "Report to the hall master that there are foreign warships in the port. There are so many. They are so big." "Okay, what's good? Tell me the key points." "They're looking for where the rudder is." "What? How do foreigners know that Natana Island is the headquarters of the Nanyang Xiandi Society?" "Them? What are they? Tell me clearly." "There is a woman on the boat who claims to be the princess of Ming Dynasty." "She? What is she? Let's make it clear once and for all. She said that people from the Xiandahu should go to the beach to meet her, otherwise they will bring peace to our nest of snakes and rats." Suddenly, there was a violent explosion outside. Dust fell rustling down, and the entire hall was shaken and filled with a choking smell. Before the people in the hall could stand still, there was another intensive gunfire outside. How could the members of the Hessian hall outside holding swords and spears resist, and quickly retreated into the entrance of the hall? Damn. Who are they? Are they those bastards from Lanfang? Or the Dutch ghosts? Hall Master Liu of Suzaku Hall cursed. "They are Chinese. But they are not from Lanfang. They don't have braids." The subordinate replied, "Damn it. This is gangsterism. Let me lead people to fight with them." Hall Master Zhang of Zuanwu Hall said, "Master, don't be impulsive. They have foreign guns in their hands. We can't beat them." The minions dissuaded them. "Report. The back is also blocked. A subordinate who went to explore the back door reported back, "What can we do? We can't fight now, and we can't escape." Hall Master Hu of the White Tiger Hall said slumpedly, while sitting on a chair at this time. Zhao Xianyuan, the leader of Qinglang Hall, said, "Let me go out and talk to them to find out which kind of immortal dares to come and cause trouble at the helm of our heaven and earth society." Zhao Xianyuan's confidence actually comes from the fact that Natana Island is the headquarters of the Nanyang Xiandahu. There are nearly 10,000 residents on the island, all members of the Xiandahu. He believes that they will come to reinforce the president soon after hearing the explosion. Someone took the lead and there were no gunshots outside. Other senior executives of UMW company also came outside under the protection of the gang. After all, what a gangster like this fears most is losing face. Zhao Xianyuan stood still, cupped his hands and said, "I would like to ask Zhao Xianyuan, the chief helm of the Nanyang Xiandahu, Qinglang Hall, who is this friend from, and why is he causing trouble for us, the Xiandahu Hall? Master Zhao, isn't it your duty to fight against the Qing dynasty and restore the Ming dynasty?" A girl in the crowd said coldly. "So, what, then? You won't kneel down when you see me?" There was an irresistible majesty in the woman's voice. "Who are you?" Zhao Xianyuan frowned. He had been in Nanyang for so many years, but he had never seen a woman dare to talk to him like this. "I am Emperor Jianwen of the Ming dynasty, the 26th grandson of Zhu Yunwen, and Princess of Nanyang, Zhu Qiangying." The woman answered. "You said you are a princess or a princess? What proof do you have? I even said I was ZHUD. Haha." Hall Master Hu of the White Tiger Hall took over and laughed loudly. However, the laughter soon stopped abruptly with the sound of a gunshot. "Why did you kill my brother?" Zhao Xianyuan roared angrily, but the younger brothers around him calmed down and advised the Hall Master to be calm, because the guns on the opposite side were obviously much more than his own, and they were all revolvers. On the other hand, the Xiandahu side had more guns, all old flintlock muskets. Hu Yaod Beihutang runs casinos and brothels in Nanyang. He claims to have 8,000 female soldiers under his command. He even married 108 concubines and called himself the chief of Liangshan. His methods are despicable. He often kills the whole family and forces girls into prostitution. Zhu Qiangying had certainly prepared enough for killing Hu Yaod. The so-called Ming dynasty pro-armies under her were just some piggies who had been deceived into Nanyang. But now that they have guns and names, they believe that they are the righteous party. Is the real Ming dynasty pro-army? That's nonsense. My brother is a decent man. Zhao Xianyuan yelled angrily. Is it true? Hall Master Zhao, you can go to Singapore or Borneo to find out about the good things your brother has done. Zhu Qiangying did not show any timidity, but the senior officials of the Xiandahu who were used to being domineering began to waver. Of course, some people who still have a little conscience in their hearts, or who are simply coerced, have other feelings. In fact, most of the Chinese who went to Nanyang were miserable people who couldn't survive in their hometowns, and a few were born bad. At this time, some gang leaders who had been oppressed for a long time began to accuse the gang bosses of their daily evil deeds. The evil deeds of several gang leaders in particular were countless, among which Zhao Xianyuan had a slightly better reputation. What Zhu Qiangying wanted was this effect. No matter how strong the fortress was from the outside, it could not withstand the explosion from the inside. Then there was another gunshot, and the leader of Xuanwu Hall, Zhang, fell down, and the largest opium dealer in West Borneo passed away. This time the applause was even louder, because Zhang Yaokei, Hall Master Zhang, had done all kinds of bad things. Anyone who has a relationship with this person will either lose all their money and live on the street, or sell their children and daughters to feed crocodiles. A local entertainment activity is to use live people to tease crocodiles to see how long people can survive in a pond full of crocodiles. Seeing that the fire was getting hot, she did not continue to kill. Instead, she described to them an utopia where everyone has clothes to wear and food to eat. As long as they work, they will be paid, and bullies no longer dare to do whatever they want. After all, her purpose here is not just to seek justice, but to establish her own power. What's more, She also wanted to witness with her own eyes the beautiful world Franz talked about. As for Franz's words about integrating the new Ming Empire into the Austrian Empire market and becoming its raw material supplier, she selectively ignored it. In fact, ordinary people at that time wanted very simple things, and it was no exaggeration to think that this was paradise. But Zhao Xianyuan is not so easy to compromise. He was born in a martial arts family. It is said that the poor are poor in culture and rich in martial arts. Those who can afford to practice martial arts are from rich families. Just like modern people who want to play football, how can they do it if they cannot keep up with nutrition? So the pursuit of nature is different. Do you have any real evidence to prove your identity as a member of the Ming clan? Zhu Qiangying took out a piece of jade seal she thought was the best, selected from Franz's box, put it on the table, and pushed it over. This is the Imperial seal inherited from the Zhu family of the Ming dynasty. Do you want to see it? Zhao Xianyuan tremblingly held up the jade seal, with 8 characters engraved below it. If you are ordered by heaven, you will live forever. This time Zhao Xianyuan believed it, and he was also willing to believe that Zhu Ming's descendants were still there, and could lead the Han people to regain their lands. But what he never expected was that the Zhu Ming royal family would recover Nanyang. Chapter 317 The Bankers Counterattack. Austria Vienna. A financial storm is brewing in the imperial capital. Since the long-term plan for the second phase of the Imperial Railway was released, the stock prices of some of its sections have been on a rising trend. Soon the price rose from 5 florins, when it was first issued, to 15 florins. Neither this stock issuance pattern nor the stock price growth is normal. Excessive speed and overhyping are expected in the eyes of experts, so when it exceeded 120% of the issue price, Ajani and her men began to suppress the stock price. Of course, the specific operations must be arrived at after discussion by specialized traders and economists, but the experts hired by Franz soon discovered a problem. That is, they could not suppress the rising trend of stock prices at all. Therefore, it was very difficult to it as easy to cross the 120% red line, and it is only a matter of time before it crosses 200%. Unlike in the past, this time the stock rise was not led by a few bankers or a few families, but was a nationwide follow-up investment. Experts feel that since this overheating cannot be stopped, it is better to choose to sell at a high point and buy back at a low point. Following the example of Archduke Franz, theoretically, there is no problem with this. The royal family is not the loser anyway. After all, the characteristic of the capital market is that the strong always get stronger, even in terms of their ability to bear risks. The royal family with a large amount of capital is far stronger than other speculators. Almost all experts assured Ajani that this would be a profitable business, but she was still a little worried, and her intuition told her that this would be a crisis in a conference room on the 3rd floor of the Caesar Hotel. Solomon Rothschild watched intently as his most admired junior was boasting. The financial crisis that would sweep across Central Europe came from this man who was less than 20 years old. Young Hans, please rest assured that this time we and the royal families and nobles of various countries will all retreat. From now on, Central Europe will be our Jewish world. Those princes, generals and ministers will only become more and more dependent on us. What will they do without us? Neither we can rely on our ingenuity to conquer Europe. There is no need to go all the way to the Middle East to fight for that poor desert with the damn Ottomans. On February 5, 1840, Eid al-Adha of the Xianfang Church, several Ottoman sects carried out a large-scale massacre of Jewish immigrants near Jerusalem, causing tens of thousands of casualties. At the same time, in another place, a young man in Arab attire was talking to the audience in front. Under the audience sat a group of financial giants from Austria, Germany, and Italy, and of course they had another. The common characteristic is that they all have loan sharking business as a result of a financial innovation policy introduced by Franz and his economists after consultation. The advent of installment payments greatly hit the loan sharking industry in Central Europe. This epoch-making measure solved the urgent needs of many people and brought positive energy to the empire's economy, allowing it to continue to develop along a healthy track. It also gave groups of different classes a glimmer of light and hope. The number of people who choose to take risks and drink poison to quench their thirst is greatly reduced. Most of them choose a predictable tomorrow point. Although the empire still did not legislate the illegal limit of usury at this time, the effect of pass it to 10, spread it to 100 made more ordinary people begin to understand that it was an unreasonable financial product point after all. The royal family's annual installment payment interest rate does not exceed 5%. Who would choose a loan shark with an annual interest rate of more than 40% or even 50%? Even the interest rates set by several large families such as the Rothschilds, who are conscientious loan sharks who are good at public relations and packaging, usually remain above 25%. The advent of the new financial model of installment payment was a weapon against these greedy financiers. It immediately beat these loan sharks to death, and their business volume and profits fell off a cliff point. Although they have the power behind them to back them up, who dares to show off as a hero in front of the royal family? What's ridiculous is that their support to the bureaucrats and evil forces cannot be cut off at all point as a result. Loan sharks often sold their sons and daughters, or even committed suicide by drowning themselves in rivers. Although some less sighted people tried to put pressure on the royal family and the government to submit by spending a lot of money and buying headlines in newspapers to demonstrate the rationality and benefits of usury point, however, Franz's offensive always refutes the so-called financial experts and directly characterizes them as those who cause harm to the country and the people. From the moral high ground point, the arguments supporting the loan shark side are nothing more than the following point. First, borrow and distort Hegel's existence is reasonable to defend yourself. Point, the description of usury in the Old Testament of the Bible is, if a poor person among my people goes with you, if you lend him money, you must not charge interest like a moneylender. Second, link usury to charity. Point, from the personal property or expected income provided by the bank or the royal family as a guarantee for installment payment. The argument can be made that no one will lend money to the poor to show his image of thinking about the poor. Point, on the other hand, he cleverly points out that those who really need money may not necessarily meet the conditions proposed by the royal family. This is the main reason why everyone hates usury, but they all need it. Point third, the fault is neither those who provide usurious loans nor those who cannot afford to repay. It is because those stupid people do not understand the inner workings of the economy and misestimate their ability to repay. Point, and those kind loan sharks should not be punished because they just did bad things with good intentions. Point fourth, loan sharking can improve people's creativity and promote the healthy development of social economy. The large amount of interest it generates will give those who owe money a good opportunity to make the most money possible and help lazy people break through their limits. Businessmen who have also received a large amount of income will have their pockets bulged and will take the initiative to purchase more products. This will also stimulate consumption and promote the development of the commodity economy. This is the approach that is most in line with the laws of the market and should be praised rather than belittled. Point fifth, optimize resource allocation and let funds go where they should go. Point, the poor only know how to eat and drink, but know nothing about making money. The concentration of large amounts of capital in the hands of bankers means more factories, major public projects and railway construction, which is of great benefit to the country without any harm. Point, and those who have no money can serve as a demographic dividend and in turn continue to stimulate economic development. Point, sixth, great powers such as Britain and France have very advanced financial and banking industries, so they can rank among the world's powerful countries. The writer hired by the other party eloquently wrote about dozens of benefits, but the core points are 3 points. First, existence is reasonable. Second, it is in line with economic laws. And third, the quality of people who do not have enough money is not good, lazy, stupid, uninformed, too small. The argument and method to deal with these people is also very simple, which is to offer 1 million florins as a bonus. As long as any financier can work in any factory or dock in London, Liverpool, Manchester for a year and earn £50, he can take away this 1 million. Point, of course, you can also take out the corresponding collateral and then invest. As long as the money earned after 3 years can repay the interest plus principal, you can get the bonus. The result, of course, was zero success among the 32 financial experts who chose to try their luck. 15 quit within a week, 10 of the remaining 17 quit within a month, and 6 of the remaining 7 died in the factory. Another went to a mental hospital. The casualties were completely within Franz's expectation. After all, given the safety conditions and work intensity of British factories at the time, it would be abnormal for more than a few to die. 5 Very wealthy financial experts chose to prove themselves in the second way. 2 of them lost their principal in the first year of investment and finally had to sell their mortgaged properties. There is also an expert who directly enjoyed the generous package treatment of the Vienna version of the West Ice Library Hotel. Because of cheating. The remaining 2 people wanted to turn around and borrowed loan sharks at high interest rates and finally had to go to the rooftop. Personally, I think Lan Fang's writing is good. And the plot design is also sophisticated. But now it's so meaningless that I feel uncomfortable watching it. Next, the protagonist will return to Europe. On the way, he will write about how the protagonist sailed here to avoid being said to have traveled through time and space. But I guess it's just this time. After all, what I write is a historical article, not a travel diary or a diary. I'm now shaken by my original intention of writing a book. So far, I have designed 6 main storylines in this book, but in the end I had to cut 5 of them. The only thing that was written was the much maligned Turkish-Egyptian war. I don't like to complain, but the huge amount of negative energy made me very depressed, making me say a lot of irrational things and do a lot of meaningless things. After finishing the updates today, I will most likely choose to take a day off tomorrow. That's it. I wish you all good luck in martial arts and always smile. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 318 The Bankers Counterattack. Since then, most bankers have no longer dared to stand up directly, but have chosen to play the emotional card, saying that the lives of loan sharks are also lives, and they also need to live. Of course this nonsense was simply ignored. In short, during several chaotic wars, the royal family gradually took the lead. Although it was denounced as retrograde and autocratic, Austria's economy was generally in a recovery stage, with tax revenue increasing significantly, and the people's consumption power also increasing. Just when things were moving in a good direction, someone saw the flaws in this model. The so-called installment payment is actually a way of saving money, but as long as the income is in line with expectations, and does not develop excessively, there will not be any big problems, and it can reduce the pressure on consumers to a certain extent, and promote the healthy growth of the economy. Compared with loan sharking, it is definitely a great progress in financial history. However, there are still gaps in the current market due to lack of norms, and corresponding laws and regulations. This existence allows financiers and speculators to take advantage of the loopholes. Due to Franz's strategy, Austria's domestic product sales prices are much lower than those in the international market. Even if tariffs are paid again, there will still be a small portion of profit left. This loophole was originally intended to leave Human behind, but in Soros's eyes, it was a golden opportunity. He first took the initiative to contact Solomon Rothschild, and then gathered a large amount of capital to prepare to monopolize some important industries in Austria, such as steel, rails, rifled gun barrels, sewing machines, clocks, rubber shoes, raincoats, glass, etc. However, Franz and the big guys he recruited had long expected this situation to happen, so they could easily deal with it by raising prices and expanding production. Although this move will cause the public to suffer some losses, it is still more conscientious than the capitalists who wantonly drive up prices after monopolizing the market. However, Soros, who was unwilling to give up, soon found a breakthrough, that is to use the royal installment mechanism to allow ordinary people to participate in the stock speculation feast. In fact, Franz was also prepared for this. In order to prevent too many retail investors, he set the investment threshold at 1,000 florins per share. But Austrian experts feel his approach hinders the concentration of capital. Under the advice of many well-known financiers and bankers such as Solomon Rothschild, the amount per share was reduced to 5 florins, so as to attract investment to the greatest extent. This approach indeed brought a huge amount of funds to the empire's stock market. At the same time, Solomon and other bankers temporarily launched a new business. That is, ordinary people could use installment payments to mortgage items to banks to obtain funds. That is to say, people can first go to the royal shop to buy goods on an installment basis and then resell them to private banks in exchange for funds to invest in the stock market. Of course, the banks will take a cut point, but at this time, the crazy stock market prices continued to soar, coupled with the exemplary effect of the first phase of the Lusitania Railway project. Everyone was more confident and believed that having the royal family to back it up would be a sure profit point. At the same time, major newspapers, banks and various so-called professionals once again hyped up railway stocks. Of course, the chicken soup for the soul poured out by Franz's side also played a role in fueling the flames. Even if the stock market is suspended every 3 days, and even sets a maximum increase, leaving a backup plan, large-scale selling still cannot extinguish Austrians' enthusiasm for railway stocks after massive wealth entered the stock market. All stocks deviated from their original true value. This is exactly what Soros wants to see. They just have to sit back and wait for them to continue to rise, and their wealth will continue to rise, which is equivalent to the entire country paying for them. When it reaches the highest point, all you need to do is sell them all to complete the harvest of 38 million people in the entire territory. Of course, in theory, the empire will not suffer losses, and it will only need to collect the arrears on schedule. But all the risks and notoriety must be borne by it, and desperate people will not only be unable to benefit from financial investments, but will also be saddled with heavy debts. It's just that at this time, Vienna's senior officials actually contacted bankers to discuss when to sell their stocks. After all, only selling at the highest point can earn the greatest profits for the empire. Jenny could only write countless letters asking for help to Franz, but with current communication methods, in addition to the repeated deduction and discussion of various possibilities before the incident, he was still drifting at sea. It is difficult to effectively obtain information and make corresponding decisions at the first time. A financial tsunami that is about to engulf the world seems inevitable on the calm Indian Ocean. A fleet flying the black and gold flag of the Austrian Empire was moving slowly. Friedrich stood alone on the flagship Venice, surrounded by people in the middle, looking around with a telescope from time to time. As a pursuing soldier and the son of Archduke Karol, Friedrich always held himself to the strictest standards and was not as casual as Franz. However, this naval expedition failed to test the combat effectiveness of his new flagship, which disappointed the naval commander, and he discovered an embarrassing fact. That is, every time he went out with his nephew, he gained land combat experience. This made him the commander of the Austrian Imperial Navy, who dealt with ships and sailors every day, very embarrassed. Friedrich very much hoped to use the Dutch stronghold on Western Borneo as a target on the grounds of helping Nanming seize the base faster, but he was quickly stopped by Franz. After all, doing so would be tantamount to starting a war with the Dutch East India Company. According to Franz's plan, Zhu Qiangying and her Nanming should seize Kalimantan Island on their own. But compared to the past, this time he seemed too stingy. Not only were none of the latest breech-loading guns provided to the opponent, but even the artillery was only dealt with 4-pounders. 2,000 revolvers were given, but this kind of light weapon was of no use at all. Its own limitations are too great, although it has the advantage of a fast rate of fire. Its range, accuracy, and power are far inferior to that of a rifle. That kind of light cannon is barely adequate for dealing with wooden gates and earthen walls, but it is completely helpless against thick stone walls, gentle slopes, and bastions. Of course, there are also factors that Franz himself planned. Strictly speaking, the armed conflicts between Nanming, Langfang, Dagang, Sanxiaogao and even the Dutch have nothing to do with war, and almost belong to the category of gang fighting. Besides, there is a weapons factory in nearby Chenla. As long as Nanming has sufficient financial resources, or has items to exchange with it, it can obtain ordnance. Since it is similar to gang fights, street fighting is inevitable. In this kind of close-range confrontation, the revolver with fast shooting speed, lightweight and easy to carry, is obviously more advantageous. Speaking of heavy firepower, Transporting heavy artillery in the complex jungle terrain of Kalimantan is difficult point, and according to Franz's estimation, he didn't think Lan Fang's disorganized organization could mount a decent resistance point, although those people showed great bravery in the face of the Austrian army that raised the Ming flag. He believed that it was just fear that dispersed reason point. Moreover, support in terms of justice and program is more important than support in weapons and money. Of course, with Austria's arms and equipment, this process will be accelerated a lot, and the possibility of accidents will be reduced a lot. Point. When the real Ming army comes back, how many people will be willing to be buried with the Qing dynasty? Compared to Lan Fang, who was not recognized by the Qing dynasty, Franz felt that the orthodox Nanming dynasty was obviously more attractive. Chapter 319 Whales traveling together. Wow, look, it's a whale. Some crew members shouted excitedly. This is a good sign, Your Highness the Grand Duke. There is a legend in my distant hometown that encountering a whale while out at sea is a sign of good luck. At this time, Oshia Suji Northeast had changed back to her previous Mika uniform. It seemed that the assimilation policy had not erased the cultural imprint on her body, but presumably Thalia was not a very good executor just at this moment. A whale jumped high out of the water and then hit the sea hard, causing a wave of waves and causing the sailors on the ship to exclaim. Point afterwards, a burst of singing from the ocean continued to spread around, warming the hearts of travelers who had been tortured by the long and boring voyage. Ethereal, sad, and distant, it seems to be a call from ancient times, but it is also as scary as the gaze into the abyss. While everyone was concentrating on admiring the spectacle of the giant beast, a discordant sound sounded on the ship. Quick, open the gun doors and get everyone into combat positions, as the commander-in-chief, Friedrich's order immediately made the entire ship busy. Sailors and middle and lower level officers began to quickly run back to their posts to prepare for battle. Even Franz was nervously searching with a telescope against the enemies on the sea point, but according to common sense, with the size of this fleet, pirates should not have the guts to attack, unless some of them can't wait to see God. Point. A maritime regiment consisting of 1 super first-class battleship, 4 quasi first-class battleships, and more than 10 other escort and supply ships is enough to defeat the navy of a medium-sized country. Point. The only people in the Indian Ocean who might pose a threat to the Austrian Imperial Navy were the British. Point. The Royal Navy deployed 25 battleships in the Indian Ocean. Although the vast majority of them were third-class battleships, it was almost impossible to escape their pursuit through the Strait of Malacca and return to Kampong Som. Point. Of course, that's just a common sense estimate. The Imperial fleet, which has all been replaced with steam power, has been completely transformed, and its sailing speed is far beyond what the British sailing battleships can match. Point. However, Franz, whose thoughts returned to reality, did not notice that there were malicious warships around. Soon other sailors also discovered this, and everyone looked at the captain who gave the order in confusion. Didn't you all see those giant beasts? You know, we haven't fired a single cannon along the way. If we don't use it anymore, the cannonballs will probably expire. Friedrich roared, but no one answered. Uncle Friedrich, please don't let your bad thoughts tarnish this rare landscape in front of you. These poor animals are no threat to you. Before Franz finished speaking, Paul Davin, the vice captain from Venice, said at the side, "The captain is right. The whole body of a whale is full of treasures. Whale oil and whale bones are valuable goods. Even if we drag them to Bombay and sell them to the British, we can still make money. Captain is wise. He is right. The whaling industry during this period was not only quite developed, but also very profitable. Point. At this time, whale oil was one of the most important lighting methods in the West and the most important lubricant in industry. It can also be used in the manufacture of textiles, leather, paints, and varnishes, and even soap. Point. A gallon of whale oil can be sold for 3 to 5 florins, but the price fluctuates greatly with supply and demand. Point. There were a variety of lighting fuels at that time, each with its own merits: paraffin, beeswax, suet oil, turpentine, but only whale oil produced almost no smoke when burned, could produce a stable light source, and had no odor among them. Sperm whale oil is the best. It not only has a bright flame, but also has a faint oily smell. Point. The main material for the fine candles used in Shunbrun Palace is sperm whale oil. Although there are paraffin candles nowadays, the price is very high due to the limited technical means and backward refining process of paraffin at that time point of course. This is only lower than spermaceti and is still a luxury product that is beyond the reach of ordinary people. In addition, due to the limitation of underdeveloped technology, industrial lubricants are mainly refined from whale oil point. If you are a fan of the industrial party, you should understand how huge the role of lubricants in industry is. It can even be said that without lubricants, the industrial revolution would not be able to proceed smoothly. The UK consumes more than 500,000 gallons of whale oil on textile machinery every year. According to American calculations, large bowhead whales can produce more than 300 barrels of whale oil, and the average can reach 150 barrels, much more than sperm whales and right whales, whose averages are 25 barrels and 60 barrels respectively. 1 barrel equals 42 gallons. In other words, in order to meet the industrial needs of the United Kingdom, at least 3,333 bowhead whales must be killed every year, 8,333 right whales, and 20,000 sperm whales. Whale bones were also a very popular commodity in the 19th century, with a wide range of uses including, but not limited to, sun hat, whip, parasol, tongue scraper, pen holder, fishing rod, divining rod, umbrella, bow tie, walking stick, garland, top hat, suspenders, folder, and paper knife, painter's wood grain comb, feet on the soles of boots, bow supports, shoehorns, brushes, mattresses, elastic linings on the inside edges of pool tables, even training swords used by nobles to practice their swift swords. Of course, these are not the most valuable uses of whale bones. The common tutu skirts and women's tight underwear in the 19th century. Men also wore tight underwear at that time, also used whale bones, but the demand was relatively small. Whalebone actually refers to whale baleen, not actual fish bones. Why doesn't Franz know about this treasure? The answer is, the Austrian Empire was not a normal country. It consumed almost no whale oil for lighting, as both Galicia and Transylvania had a tradition of using oil point as for public lighting. The Austrians used gas lamps except for the nobility and Italians living on the sea. Almost no one cared about whale oil. The oil that lubricates machinery is a mixture of rapeseed oil and petroleum. Its output can not only supply and meet domestic demand, but also sell well in German states. As for whale bones, Austria imports large quantities of this raw material from the United States for its long-term production of hats and mattresses, and uses it to make women's petticoats and corsets. There was a very strange phenomenon at that time, that is, the whalebone used to make hats and mattresses was a few tenths of the price of the whalebone used to make women's petticoats and corsets, and the actual difference between the two was almost non-existent. Except for a few rip-offs, almost all clothing merchants and tailors chose cheaper whale bones closer to home. Franz felt that firing cannons and frying fish was a disobedient and unlucky act, and there was no need for him to do so. Uncle Friedrich, whales are a symbol of good luck. Don't you think so, Miss Shanayan? When Franz turned to look at Oshiyasajin, the latter held a knife and fork, as if he was ready to rush down to cook, and could not listen to the former's words at all. Franz couldn't help but hold his forehead. He forgot that the woman in front of him was Japanese. She probably hadn't tasted sushi for a long time, and wanted to give the whale a tooth as a sacrifice. It seems necessary to give her a big meal. After all, there are only river fish near Vienna, and there are only two ways to eat them, grilled and fried. Austrians are one of the few people in Europe who like to eat freshwater fish, but they, like other Europeans, have a very bad opinion of fish bones and hate them very much. The solution is also very simple and crude, that is, directly sear or fry the fish, which can minimize the trouble of picking fish bones. Chapter 320 Target Calcutta. Take back your meaningless orders, Uncle Friedrich. We don't need these animals to prove our strength. As Franz talked, he walked to the toolbox and picked up an iron bucket and a shovel. He also found a rope and tied it around his waist and then went straight to the side of the boat. Seeing his eagerness to try, the bystanders around him felt very strange and puzzled. Oshio Shanayan seemed to have thought of something, but thought it was too ridiculous and gave up. Just when she was stunned, he jumped out. In fact, this was Franz's dream in his previous life. He jumped out from the side of the ship and landed just on the whale's back. Of course, this strange intruder was likened to this huge baleen whale. It didn't mind this uninvited guest's visit. On the contrary, it deliberately slowed down to avoid throwing him away. His behavior caused exclamations, and the people on the ship desperately shouted to pull him back, but they were sternly refused. After that, Franz's actions accelerated everyone's heartbeats. He picked up the shovel and started to smash the forehead of the sea monster. Everyone thought Franz was crazy. He actually wanted to kill such a huge ancient beast with a shovel. However, the whale that was attacked did not fight back or try to get rid of the tiny human on it, but instead made a strange cry. Franz was actually using a shovel to pluck barnacles, parasites that often appear on large baleen whales. The reason why they jumped out of the water so frequently before was to get rid of these burdens. Given how tightly the barnacles glue themselves together, the whale's efforts are doomed to be in vain. There is only one final outcome for being parasitized by barnacles, and that is death. But before that, they will experience a long period of pain. Barnacle damage is fatal to whales, as well as ships, but it is a delicacy for foodies who can enjoy it. The Archduke's strange behavior aroused great curiosity among the entire fleet members. Unless they saw it with their own eyes, they would find it difficult to believe that there really is such a crazy person in the world. They witnessed his agility as he walked about on flat ground, jumping from the back of one whale to another to the exclamation of onlookers. These gentle ocean giants did not attack this tiny visitor from beginning to end, but instead circled around him. Franz also carried barrel after barrel of barnacles to the ship via ropes until the cleanup was complete. He put the shovel back into the bucket, sat on the giant whale and slowly moved forward with the waves. He seemed to be in a much better mood. The surrounding warships had quieted down at this time, and the officers and soldiers were like riding a roller coaster, from the initial panic to the later amazement, and in the end there was only silence, leaving endless emotions. It turns out that there are really people in this world who are different. At this time, the leading female whale suddenly let out a scream, and then the entire group of whales became restless, trying desperately to drive this little friend away. The method was to keep spraying water at him. Although this seemed to be a very interesting game in the eyes of others, he could feel the restlessness of the entire whale group. Franz returned to the ship, and Friedrich no longer knew how to communicate with his nephew, so he could only say, "Ah, you a monster." Of course not, but we don't have time to discuss this anymore. There seems to be some bad omen ahead. Franz said, Is it a sea monster? Don't worry, with our powerful ships and cannons, what can even the Kraken do to me? Friedrich's subjective consciousness told him that a monster was coming, which made the passionate commander chatter. To be honest, Franz really doesn't know what there is in the sea that can scare these behemoths. After all, theoretically speaking, adult large baleen whales should have no natural enemies. Of course, this is only based on the common sense of future generations. Suddenly a pod of whales swam in front of the Venetian and tried to steer the giant ship in another direction. It's unbelievable. What are these beast friends of yours doing? Friedrich asked. I don't know. Is there some natural miracle ahead? Franz asked. It's Calcutta, Oshiyasajin said excitedly, while holding the map carefully and looking at it. At this time, she had completely regarded Franz as a god, or some kind of supernatural existence. At this time, suddenly a large number of seabirds flew from the southwest and passed over the fleet. The sea also became lively, with a large number of fish surging crazily towards the east, the direction they came from, jumping out of the water and splashing in the waves. What on earth is it? The strange natural phenomenon made Friedrich murmur in his heart. But changing direction now would mean not being able to reach Mumbai on time and delaying the trip. I think it's safer to just follow the whale's lead. At this time, Franz's words seemed to have magic power. For the first time, the sailors and officers on the ship moved beyond Friedrich, the captain and commander, and began to act. Well, it seems we were kidnapped by these damn whales, Friedrich complained. After all, he felt that his authority had been challenged, and he always wanted to find some face to come back. Uncle Friedrich, maybe you will be grateful to them later. Even if nothing happens, it doesn't matter. Let's just treat it as an intimate contact with the ocean nature. At this time, Calcutta was the center of British-ruled India, serving as both a political and economic center. It was also the largest port in the eastern part of the vast British South Asian colony and the center of the entire linen textile industry. Its urban population was once close to 400,000. Faced with increasing demands, the British began their own ambitious plans to build a direct railway to Peshawar and a telegraph center to the Indian subcontinent. In addition, this city in the Ganges Delta in eastern India is also the largest opium trading center in Asia and the world. There are nearly 400 Chinese living in this city. They are either tea farmers who were deceived, or opium merchants who came here to trade. After several hours of sailing, the whales acting as navigators indeed led Franz and his party to Calcutta. After completing their mission, these intelligent creatures screamed again, as if saying goodbye to someone, and then quickly dived into the sea and disappeared without a trace. It seems that we are going to be fleeced by the British twice, which is really unpleasant. Friedrich laughed at himself. He was still worried about the matter of docking in Calcutta. In fact, after leaving Malacca, based on the amount of supplies carried on the ship, there is no problem in flying directly to Mumbai. But if you stop in Kolkata, it is very necessary to replenish enough food, water, and fuel. The same is true for Mumbai later, otherwise it would be impossible to support the port of Mombasa. Mombasa is a port in eastern Africa. It was an important trading port more than 3,000 years ago. It was also one of the farthest ports visited by Zheng He in the Ming dynasty. But unfortunately, there is no coaling station here, which means that Franz's steam battleship will be at risk of being shut down. But in order to successfully reach the Cape of Good Hope, enough fuel must be left, so the subsequent voyage from Mumbai to Mombasa must rely on wind power. The prerequisite is that the fleet has enough supplies to avoid capsizing in the vast and endless sea. At this time, the Cape of Good Hope was one of the most dangerous routes in the world. This was not because of the elusive local pirates, but because of the terrible westerly storm. This place is also known as the Cape of Storms. The most famous natural phenomenon in the area is the killer wave. The wave height can be close to 20 meters, like the top of Mount A, which can easily tear large merchant ships into pieces. Chapter 321 Turbulent Waves. March 15th. 1842, Sunny. Friedrich put aside the logbook he had just finished writing in his hand, and couldn't help but sigh at the unpredictable nature of nature. His officers and soldiers were also surprised by the unexpected sea conditions in front of them. This place is only a day's sail from Calcutta. Just as he was about to order the fleet to move towards the destination at full speed, suddenly the vision reappeared. Strong winds came up, and the sea surface suddenly stirred up waves, even sending the 4,700-ton super battleship Venetia away to a height of 5 meters. Emergency. Avoidance. Friedrich shouted. What's worse is that, as soon as he finished speaking, the flag bearer's command flag on the mast instantly fell out of his hands and disappeared without a trace. The entire fleet could only rely on usual training and exercises to understand and execute the orders of its commander. Follow the flagship closely. The ship trembled violently, almost throwing the people on it away. Franz returned to the cabin in shock under the protection of a group of guards. What exactly is going on? With lingering fear, he couldn't help but speak. Even in Namibia, known as the Gate to Hell, he had never encountered such changeable sea conditions. Through the porthole, he could see the thunder in the distant sky. The originally clear sky was changing to gloomy at a speed visible to the naked eye, and all the storms were converging in the same direction. The clouds seemed to be torn apart, and huge waves drove the sea water to spread rapidly in all directions. This huge flagship was as weak and helpless as a lonely fallen leaf on the sea at this time. The hull of the ship shook violently, and everything in the cabin flew around with a shaking point. Whether it is furniture or beds, even living people like Franz and Oshiesuji are not immune. It can be said that in the face of disaster, everything in the world is equal. Suddenly, there was a loud banging sound like exploding beams outside, and hailstones as big as fists fell from the sky. Even the deck made of oak and covered with teak also left potholes of different sizes. As one of the clear evidence of close contact with natural disasters, a few unlucky sailors who were unable to escape were unfortunately killed on the spot. Some people tried to rescue their companions, but the violent ups and downs of the battleship threw the injured and the rescuer into the waves. The ruthless seawater crazily devoured everything on the sea, and even the air became stagnant. Everyone felt dizzy, their dizziness heightened by the low air pressure point. Fortunately, the Venetia is equipped with the latest tempered glass, and the principle comes from the current tiers of Rubes. This became the famous bulletproof glass. Its strength, toughness, and impact resistance are more than 5 times that of ordinary glass. Even if it cannot withstand the pressure, it will only break into small obtuse angled particles similar to honeycombs, making it less likely to cause secondary damage to people. The surrounding sea became darker and darker, and the entire fleet seemed to be in the dark. Under the orders of the officers, all the warships lit their lights. Could it be that we were attacked by a tornado? Franz first instinctively thought of this natural devil. It's a tsunami, Oshiasajin said desperately. No nation in the world is more in awe of tsunamis than the Japanese. The black sky reflected the sea water into deep black, and the sky and the earth presented a doomsday scene of dark sky and dark sun. The only light source was the lightning that continuously cut through the night sky, revealing the ferocious appearance of the world. The dark waves kept lapping at the side of the ship, and the angry waves passed through below, one wave higher than the other. The entire sea turned into a roaring beast, opening a huge abyss mouth to swallow everything in the world. Friedrich was still at his command position fearlessly, but 7 of his messengers had gone to sea. Compared with the few battleships that were relatively intact, the real lives hanging on were the accompanying frigates and transport ships. The officers and soldiers on the Venetia watched them being swallowed up by the Black Sea several times and emerging from the water several times. The weak light on the flagship became their only beacon point after an unknown period of time. This disaster seemed to show no signs of stopping. The sky was covered with dark clouds, and streaks of lightning pierced the darkness. From time to time, heavy rain and fist-sized hail fell. On the sea, huge waves like gables rose higher and higher. There are even undercurrents surging underwater, making it extremely difficult to control the ship's sailing direction. Fortunately, Friedrich was a very good captain and could make the most correct judgment every time, saving the fleet from danger. While Franz and others were struggling at sea, the Indian Ocean coast was experiencing an impact that was more than 10 times stronger than here. Waves more than 30 meters high hit the British Royal Navy Indian Ocean fleet anchored in the port. Their flagship was swept more than 500 meters inland and ended its life shattered into thousands of pieces. 7 of its 25 battleships were sent away by the tsunami, and the remaining ones also suffered heavy damage and lost their combat capabilities. The tsunami penetrated nearly 15 kilometers inland, and several important port cities in the Indian Ocean suffered huge losses. Houses were destroyed, and a large number of people who had no time to evacuate were either drowned or shot alive on the coast. However, this is only the first wave of impact. There will be second and third waves after that, and they will become stronger and stronger. Although the epicenter was close to the Arabian Sea, the entire Indian Ocean was affected. The Austrian fleet in the deep sea suffered the least losses, with only 2 ships sunk and 320 people missing or dead. After an unknown amount of time, a hole finally opened in the dark sky, and the long lost sunlight shone in again. The sea gradually became calm, and the ships and sailors swallowed by the sea disappeared without a trace. It was as if nothing had ever happened. Only the pitted decks still silently told the horror of the previous natural disaster. The officers and soldiers walked out of the ship's cabin one after another. Everyone was glad that they were still alive. Some cried loudly, and some knelt down to pray. But more people chose to return to their posts and continue working, starting to inspect the ship and count the losses. At this time, Friedrich was helped out of the captain's cabin. The bandage on his forehead was still stained with blood. Damn beasts. They obviously led us here on purpose. They must want us to overturn the boat and then swallow us one by one. With a gloomy expression on his face, he naturally regarded the whales as a scapegoat and said angrily. At this time, Ashiasajian interrupted at an inappropriate time. It was those whales who saved us. If we were on the shore, or according to the original plan, the wave height we encountered would not be 4 to 5 meters. What? Does a mere servant know? Friedrich, who was still angry, was irritated and sneered with disdain. He had always positioned this oriental girl as Franz's pet and nothing more, just like a horse or a kitten kept in a noble family. There are frequent tsunamis in my hometown. Waves of 10 meters are common. Once the sea god is angry, it is not surprising that it can even hit the shrine on the mountainside. But what we just encountered was just a relatively large wave. Oshiasa Jean continued to retort, but was stopped by Franz's eyes and gestures. That's enough. We don't have time to waste on pursuing responsibility. First, we should count the losses as soon as possible. Second, we should find a suitable docking point as soon as possible. If you have anything to say, we can't talk about it until we get to the shore. The top priority is to dock for rest, not discuss who is right and who is wrong. In fact, when a tsunami occurs, the closer you are to the open sea, the safer you are. On the contrary, the closer you are to the shore, the greater the impact you will suffer, because when a tsunami occurs, the speed of the waves is related to the depth of the water. The deeper the wave, the slower the impact speed, and on the coast, the speed often exceeds 150 km per hour. The height of coastal waves is also several times that of deep water areas, and may even produce a superimposed effect, forming a wall of water that can cause devastating damage to everything that blocks it. When Franz and his party arrived at the coast of Calcutta, everyone was stunned by the sight before them. Thank you book friend for your tip on things you don't know. Please vote. Chapter 322 Disaster Relief. The clouds stopped, and the rain stopped, and a huge fleet appeared on the calm sea point. Although the people on the ship did not see the rainbow at this time, they felt a sense of joy in surviving the disaster. Thanks to the new compass installed on the ship, Friedrich's fleet did not lose its course. After a day of sailing, we saw the port of Calcutta not far away. This port is prosperous, visible to the naked eye, and everyone heaved a sigh of relief. After all, the ocean-going fleet needs to purchase a large amount of materials. It is obvious that remote areas cannot meet its huge needs, not even the largest port of Bangkok on the Indochina Peninsula. However, Friedrich put down the telescope and said very seriously, "It seems that your whale friends are right. If we had stayed on the shore when the incident happened, we would probably have the same ending as the British." Franz took the telescope handed to him by the other party. The sight in front of him made him a little unbelievable. The large number of bustling buildings on the coast were actually piled up from the fragments of ships and trestles. They were just visible to people in the distance. A visual error when the fleet finally sailed into the port. The real tragedy after the tsunami was revealed to everyone. There was devastation as far as the eye could see. Dozens of ships were piled up like hills, and the sea and the coast were filled with bloated corpses. The once bustling port has now become a ghost town. Because the dock was destroyed, Franz and his party could only take a small boat to the shore point. Only after landing on shore did Franz deeply understand the horror of this natural disaster. In his previous life, he had seen hundreds of boats fighting over the floodwaters, but it pales in comparison to the desolation and misery before our eyes. The once huge battleship was cut off at the waist, and the wooden piles originally used to secure the dock were uprooted and inserted deeply into the stone building called the Port Authority. The sailors of the Austrian Navy have already begun rescue operations. In addition to finding survivors, the main purpose is to find available supplies. After all, they have also suffered considerable losses. Although the city of Calcutta, which is dozens of kilometers away, may not be destroyed by the tsunami, it may not have the navigation supplies that the Austrians need. Their point of course, there is some intention of taking advantage of the situation. After all, there is no surveillance in this era, and many goods did become ownerless after this disaster. So what's wrong with being prepared? At least during the period after Austria and his team landed, they did not see other organizations or individuals carrying out rescue operations, so it was natural to receive some remuneration. After a day of rescue, a total of more than 2,000 bodies were found. Except for 300 white people, the others were all native Indians. The more than 4,000 people who were rescued were divided into 4 different areas according to language, skin color, and position. Of course, their temporary residences must be made of local materials, and they even need to be built by themselves. Many British officers stationed in India who were confused about the situation were still complaining, and even wanted to complain about the barbaric behavior of the Austrians. Damn it. This is a shameless invasion. Calcutta belongs to the United Kingdom. The British gentleman who refused to register his identity was even prepared to draw a gun in protest in front of the Austrian Imperial officers. Of course, those who waited were sent to see God in advance, and the people around him who behaved strangely also suffered the same fate. Although his own rescue behavior was due to Franz's compassion, he would not exchange the gratitude of others at the expense of his country's outstanding soldiers. After that, the remaining people who raised objections quickly understood the current situation under the friendly persuasion of the Austrian naval soldiers. Among them, the Indians were the first to understand the situation. Whether they were lowly Vaishyas and Sudras, or noble Brahmins and Kshatriyas, they all followed the Austrian instructions very obediently, building houses for themselves, registering identity information, and distributing materials and food. The white survivors were uniformly placed in a better location, received more abundant material rations, and had greater rights to move around. Although they complained in their hearts, facing the sharp bayonets and black muzzles of the Austrian marines, they dared not speak out. Then all the opium merchants were gathered together and enjoyed a building that looked intact on the outside, but was soaked in seawater inside. At this time, the interior of the building was like a water prison, but the Austrian soldiers outside the door, who were armed with live ammunition and did not understand the language, made these people dare not resist, and they had to spend the night in this environment. Of course, Franz was not completely inhumane. These opium merchants got box after box of damp opium. Due to the harsh laws of the Austrian Empire, no soldier dared to hide opium secretly, and only the ship's doctor left a step as medical supplies. Of course, some people received Franz's permission and were invited to spend the night on the Austrian Empire's warships. The vast majority of them are local British officials and technical experts, or scholars, and of course there are a small number of Indians. Among them is the famous Indian national hero Tandiyar Tobe. Although he is the king of an Indian state, he is not welcomed by Westerners this time. He was really flattered to be the guest of a Western prince and sit on his right hand. Even the general manager of the port authority can only sit in the third position on the left, while other Indian kings can only sit in the corner. Tandiyar Tobe learned from the conversation among this group of Westerners that the two young princes at the table had a high status in the Western world, and had brought a sizable army with them. There were not many British troops here originally, and coupled with the impact of that tsunami, the balance of power between the two sides changed dramatically. At the same time, the Austrian navy's strong approach, after waiting for the shore, and during the disaster relief process made people dare not neglect them. Of course Franz's explanation is a necessary means to restore order. However, it seems that these two people did not visit here for the purpose of fighting. They just saw the damage here and decided to park here briefly to replenish supplies and maintain the ship while rescuing people. Mr. Tandiyar, I heard that you are very brave. Faced with Franz's sudden inquiry, Tandiyar seemed a little panicked. After all, a low-level British military attaché could usually make it difficult for him, a local king. At this time, the immediate superior of the low-level military attaché was like a pug begging for mercy in front of the prince. Not only him, but even the usually aloof white gentlemen in the entire banquet hall were like the lowest slaves, trying to please this kid who looked only 12 or 13 years old, which made people feel very ridiculous. The harbor master on the side said quickly, "You are absolutely right, Archduke Franz. This Indian once killed 3 tigers in one day with bow and arrow and spear. Is it just a tiger?" Friedrich had a playful expression on his face. In his eyes, his brothers and nephews were much more ferocious than wild beasts. Moreover, land beasts such as tigers and lions, including elephants, are too small compared with the deep-sea behemoths in the sea, and they pose no threat to his tall and powerful battleships. But I heard Franz describe that there is a mythical beast in the east called the Tibetan Mastiff that can sink battleships. Although I don't know whether it is true or false, I can tell the truth by firing a few shots and trying it out. Grand Duke Friedrich, tigers are very ferocious animals. They are good at hiding, tracking, and, before the British official finished speaking, Friedrich slapped his pistol on the table. "Tell me, how many bullets can it take?" This official's face was full of embarrassment that could not be concealed. A straight soldier like Friedrich, who had not received the education of an eldest son, was really unable to handle such matters in foreign exchanges. That Depends on whether he drank too much. Franz smiled and helped the British official out of the siege, which immediately caused a burst of laughter at the wine table, which greatly alleviated the embarrassment at this time. Friedrich also realized that he did not belong to the banquet, so he picked up the wine glass and took a sip of wine and said, "Franz, I think the barnacles I dug taste good, so I won't talk to you anymore." After saying that, he walked away, leaving only the adjutant to temporarily take his place. After 3 rounds of wine and 5 tastes of food, Franz once again brought up the matter of tiger hunting. "Mr. Tandaya, if you buy the weapons produced by us in Austria, coupled with your bravery, there will be 10 tigers, let alone 5 tigers." Chapter 323, A Gentleman's Revenge is Never Too Late. After dinner, Franz had to run to the toilet. This wasn't because he wanted to lick his throat, but because he wanted to let go. After all, he drank too many drinks in one night. Afterwards, he returned to his room under the protection of the guards. As soon as he entered the room, he found that Friedrich was indeed boiling barnacles. Of course, it's better to look at the rawness than the rawness. Just use tweezers to pick out the barnacle meat, pour it in water, dip it in mustard, and eat it raw. "Mustard? Where did you get such a thing?" Franz asked very curiously. After all, he and his party had not encountered a store selling mustard during this trip to South Asia. Of course he didn't know that this was his misunderstanding. In ordinary people's perception, only the Chinese and Japanese are fond of this condiment, but in fact, green mustard originally originated in Europe and is an ordinary condiment. The kitchen, Oshiasajin replied. "Why? Is there such a thing on the ship?" Franz asked with some confusion. "Every ship will bring some of this stuff and add it to the dishes to prevent the crew from having diarrhea. This is just an ordinary condiment. What's the fuss about?" Friedrich said casually. "Oh, are there any business opportunities?" Friedrich felt that Franz always had some weird ideas. "No, Archduke." "Franz, do you want to taste it?" Dayan Shanayan asked expectantly. Franz made an embarrassed expression. After all, in his impression, mustard seemed to be only used when treating people. "That's such a pity." Oshiasajin put a piece of barnacle meat covered with mustard into his mouth, and after savoring it carefully, he showed a very intoxicated expression. But Franz still thought this thing was scary, so he turned to Friedrich and asked, "Do you want to eat too?" Friedrich glanced at Franz, then took a spoonful of mustard and put it on his plate. Just when Franz was curious about what the other party was going to do next, Friedrich picked up the plate and wiped off the mustard with his tongue, showing a fierce look that reminded Franz of the man who died by licking a poison dart assassin. "It tastes pretty good." Franz felt numb all over, so he took the opportunity to find a corner and sit down. "Why? Do you want to invite those British guys with their noses in the air to dinner? Have you forgotten how arrogant they were towards us before?" Friedrich was still full of confusion and disapproval of Franz's banquet with the British. After all, these Anglo-Saxons, who started as pirates, made things difficult for their own fleet on the way here. This was why the Imperial soldiers shot each other later. The military affairs foreshadowed the situation. During the previous trip to Southeast Asia, the Royal Navy even dispatched a fleet to follow them all the way, to monitor every move of their Austrian counterparts, and even played deliberately provocative tricks, such as opening gun doors, to show off force. This approach certainly caused great dissatisfaction on the part of the Austrian Empire. After all, this behavior was almost the same as declaring war, but facing the British Indian Ocean Fleet. Even Friedrich, who was full of energy and confidence, did not think he was sure of victory. Even if they are lucky enough to defeat the opponent, they will still have to face the pursuit and interception of their African fleet and Mediterranean fleet on the way back. This is simply an endless and impossible task. It's just that times have changed. A sudden tsunami a few days ago completely overturned the British's extremely firm self-confidence. 2 of the 8 battleships anchored in Calcutta were directly scrapped, and the remaining 6 became a pilot this time. Landlubber. As for the local East India Company employees in India, they have even changed their faces to please their new masters, and their pious expressions are like pilgrims. In fact, these chameleons cannot be blamed. Although the Austrians arrived here for only more than a day, they seemed to be more terrifying than the British point, whether in terms of the size of the ships or the appearance and quality of the officers and soldiers. This Austrian ocean-going fleet is far stronger than the British colonial army in India. The Indian carpenters, who are accustomed to adapting to the wind, naturally saw this. Tonight, many Kshatriya girls boarded the Austrian warships and prepared to fight against the officers and sailors. Of course, other interested parties also intentionally or unintentionally from them and other channels. A lot of information was obtained about the number of British troops garrisoned in Calcutta and their defense configuration. However, Franz, who got this valuable information, was not crazy enough to plan to take over India. He just derived from this intelligence the primary reason why the British suddenly became so cowardly. There are still more than 3,000 British troops stationed in Calcutta, but more than half of them belong to the Navy. The number of Indian soldiers is more than 10,000, but the equipment and morale of those people alone are not enough to support them from rashly starting a war with the real army. As the proverb goes, how arrogant they were before, they are now so mean. Franz replied with a smile, don't be easily fooled by their appearance. Those unruly guys will not give in. What you see now is just the superficial obedience. In fact, when we come to visit next time, they will still be the same as before. A bad face. As a soldier, Friedrich had his own pride, so he did not agree with his nephew's conclusion. This may be what Mencius said, that the mighty cannot be surrendered. Franz sighed in his heart, and then changed the subject. Uncle Friedrich, actually my purpose just now was to make those British people miserable. Really? Then why is a different scene shown in front of me? They gobbled like beggars who haven't eaten for 3 days, wasting a lot of precious supplies on our ship. Friedrich said with a hint of irony. Uncle Friedrich, you are wrong. Those are their own supplies. I just redistributed them for them. Franz explained slowly that a day's search had yielded rich fruits for the Imperial voyage fleet, and having the right to allocate resources directly makes oneself the big boss here. Several German businessmen and Italian workers were also discovered during the disaster relief process. Not only did they receive better care, they also recovered their losses. These businessmen and workers have been living and sleeping overseas for many years, and this experience can be said to have completely changed them. For the first time in their lives they were glad to be German/Italian. They are proud of who they are at the moment, but that will turn into a true sense of honor in the near future. No wonder that fat bastard brags every day that you are a great man descended from heaven. Friedrich didn't know what to say for a moment. He thought Franz's saint disease was causing another headache, so he went to save him. People, it doesn't matter if you are generous to others, as long as the result is good, it can't be considered a mistake. If we didn't maintain order and effectively organize disaster relief, God knows how many people would lose their lives. Franz's righteous words spoke so confidently, as if everything was how it should be. Oshia, who had not interrupted, felt more and more that he was right. After all, in her life experience, order would collapse after every tsunami, and a series of human tragedies would occur. Sometimes, I really think you should be a philosopher. Well, what are you going to do next? The Indians sitting at the table just now are rich and powerful local nobles. They are obviously not favored by the British, because those British guys covet their land and wealth. And what we can do is provide them with protection. As soon as he said this, he was interrupted by Friedrich. Do you want to establish a protectorate and collect protection fees from it? Franz was speechless for a while. It seemed that this guy who was immersed in the Navy really knew nothing about politics, or perhaps the political methods of this era were too simple. No, that will anger the British, not to mention that we don't have the strength to confront them head on. Is there any other way? Free trade, speak English, we sell guns, cannons, whatever they want to buy. We can also provide mercenaries and commanders when necessary. Friedrich asked in confusion, but this is the territory of the British. They will not allow those goods to enter India. Why do you think I entertained those pugs? Franz asked. Friedrich couldn't help but take a breath, and then looked at Oshia. Miss, I'm afraid you will be tricked into bed by this boy one day, and you will have to wash his quilt. Oshio Shanain responded with a smile. It was an honor. Chapter 324 Message. The rescue operation continued the next day. Under the command of the Austrian officers, more people were rescued, more usable supplies were searched out, and the port's functions continued to be restored. Of course, in exchange, the dock workers who were rescued and gathered would first repair the damaged Austrian warship. Under reasonable management and incentives, the efficiency of these shipwrights has increased to an unprecedented level. At this rate, the repairs could be completed within 2 weeks. The actual number of casualties in this disaster was much higher than Franz imagined. In the following days, more than 1,000 swollen and smelly corpses were found, and they had to be cremated quickly to avoid the emergence of the plague. The thoughtful Franz would naturally not be idle. He took this opportunity to win over a group of self-righteous British officials and celebrities in India with sugar-coated bullets. After all, the machinery, clocks and other small crafts of the Austrian Empire were indeed better than those of the United Kingdom. Even better in addition, advanced Austrian-made revolvers, street fighting weapons, are also sought after by locals. Of course, those Indian kings were even more eager to invite Franz Nanisar Bankar Singh, who are already powerful and have long been dissatisfied with the British, like Tandjai Toby, are the key targets for him to win over. These Indian princes are richer than they imagined, and they are all willing to establish long-term and stable trade relations with Austria. Even the anti-British fighter Baji Rao II, who was far away in Zanxi, secretly sent an envoy to contact Franz after receiving the flying pigeon message from Tandjai Toby. But one thing is very confusing. That is, more than 10 days have passed, the repair work of the Austrian ship is nearing completion, and the dock has been basically restored, but the British rescue team is still missing. Of course, what is not known to everyone is that the other party's slow response was because they encountered another big trouble during this period, that is, the Sequoia army that invaded Afghanistan suffered a disastrous defeat. Although they persisted for 2 months longer than in history, they got nothing except higher costs and more exaggerated casualty figures. The British troops retreating from Kabul were chased and killed by Akbar Khan's main force. Coupled with the bad weather and environment, and constant harassment by tribal armed forces along the way, only one man remained in the team of more than 20,000 people. The doctor, who was left with one arm, returned to Jalalabad Castle alone. Jalalabad Castle, a British border fortress, George Eden, the active advocate and proposer of the war in Afghanistan, grew old overnight. He never imagined that the invincible Redwood Army would actually fall into this barren desert. Not long ago, he had just been awarded the title of Earl of Auckland. If he lost Afghanistan at this time, not only would his position as the governor of India be in doubt, but his political career would also be ended. Compared with his own political future, the governor did not pay attention to the natural disaster and tsunami. He immediately ordered the British troops stationed in various places to immediately transfer half of their troops northward to retake Kabul at all costs. George Eden's approach directly led to the emptiness of troops in the Indian region. Fortunately, most of the locals are relatively honest. Only the powerful Sikh Empire was ready to make a move. After all, after Ranjit Singh's reforms, they had the strongest artillery in the Indian subcontinent and the infantry and cavalry second only to the British. Their total strength once reached 80,000 people. The Sikh Empire has 14 standing artillery regiments with 192 artillery pieces and more than 4,500 gunners. Although the size of the establishment has been reduced with Ranjit's death, it is still the strongest presence on the Indian subcontinent. In addition, they also adopted a comprehensive French-style military reform, from training to organization to tactics. The threat of the Sikhs was understandable to British India, and George Eden had to once again mobilize troops from various places to defend against this powerful enemy. At this time, Calcutta was almost an empty city. The British commander stationed here could only strictly prohibit contact with the Austrians who landed ashore, and must not anger them. However, it is a good thing for the Austrians that the British will not come. After all, the transfer of power and materials will be very troublesome by then. In this case, it is better to leave the situation to its own devices and simply solve the problem according to your own wishes, balancing the interests of all parties. As for those unowned items that can be transported back to the mainland, they will be accepted, and those that cannot be transported will be used as rewards for the hard work of the Indians and boatmen. Franz is once and for all approach benefited everyone. At least on the surface they all looked grateful. When the Imperial fleet slowly sailed away from the port, people gathered on the newly restored pier to bid farewell. There was also an interesting episode. That is, some Indian reformists came to Calcutta and wanted to ask the Austrians for advice on reform. It's just that these people showed contempt when they saw that the leaders of the Austrian Empire were two children. Friedrich was relatively short and didn't have the habit of growing a beard, so he looked about 15 or 16 years old. Although Franz looks like a young adult from the old city, he is actually only 12 years old. There were also unexpected exceptions. For example, the envoy sent by Baji II was actually a 7 or 8-year-old girl. When she saw Franz, she couldn't help but snorted with disdain. "Aren't you a child too? Why are you humming? Humph." The little girl made that voice again. It seems that Franz needs to let her know the price of arrogance, ignorance, and weakness. Although she came on horseback and had practiced Indian martial arts since she was a child, she was still unable to fight back in front of Franz, an expert with rich life experience. Franz put it under his arm, and after a harmonious exchange, he convinced him, and then asked, "What's your name?" The little girl has received training that is unbearable for ordinary people since she was a child, but she has never been bullied, let alone lost to others. She felt extremely aggrieved after being persuaded by him. The other party didn't answer, so Franz had to raise her hand again, and this time she answered very quickly, "Lakshmi. Pay. It would be great if it were like this earlier." His sister Maria, who was spoiled by her parents, was also naughty and mischievous all day long, so she had to go out in person to let her know the rules. Although this is a bit cruel, the sooner she understands the rules and bottom line, the better. Otherwise, sooner or later, she will be hurt even more or cause a catastrophic disaster that no one can solve, and she will regret it if she wants to. That's too late. What's the purpose of your coming here? Deliver the letter, then. Why do you entrust such a heavy trust to a young man? Isn't there anyone else? The prince is unable to leave his territory because the British are watching him, so he has no choice but to let me come. Lakshmi. Pei is telling the truth. Baji II once raised the flag of rebellion. After his defeat, his movements were restricted throughout his life. At this moment Franz stretched out his hand to her. Lakshmi Pei looked at the other party with confusion. "Where's the letter?" "It's a message, then. Why didn't you tell me earlier?" Afterwards, Franz had another friendly exchange with him, and only then did he learn the content of the oral message. To be honest, he was a little disappointed because the prince's behavior made Franz feel a little disdainful. The oral message is very long, but it can be summed up in 4 words: drive the tiger away and swallow the wolf. This Baji II hoped to restore his status through the help of Austria, or at least deal some blow to the British. As for those silly things like measuring India's material strength in the empire's favor, admiring Western civilization, and being willing to convert to Catholicism, they are all empty promises. What Franz looked down upon even more was that this man who thought he was a hero actually sent a little girl to deliver the message. For safety's sake, of course. After all, who would have thought that a little girl would bring such a long message? In addition, Tongyan Wuji, whether it is for the British or the Austrians, he can pass all the responsibilities on to a little girl. Looking at the poor little girl beside him, Franz opened a box and gave her a lollipop and a new watch. Lakshmi Pei, who received the gift, wiped her tears and left happily. Chapter 325 Mysterious Businessman. For the time being, smuggling between Austria and India seems to be an uneconomical deal, but in terms of the long-term development of the empire, it is undoubtedly a clever move. After all, with the continuous development of the industrial age, exchanges between the East and the West are inevitable, will continue to deepen. And a fire in the backyard is definitely the most distressing way for the British. After all, India is the UK's financial and tax center, and it also profoundly affects the geopolitical pattern. It was the British occupation of India that greatly increased the cost for Western powers to travel to the Far East, which contributed to the subsequent rise of the United States and Japan. Due to Franz's influence in this time and space, technology is developing faster than in history, and rubber will be one of the most important raw materials. in the industry in the future. Franz would not give up such an important source of raw materials in Southeast Asia to others. Otherwise he would suffer the same fate as Germany. Even if Austria defeated the British at sea, it would be impossible to send a fleet to escort resources all the way from Southeast Asia to Europe. Otherwise, even if Franz builds an invincible army, they will eventually perish due to constant consumption. If you want to change your destiny against nature, you can't just follow the crowd. Forewarned is forearmed. Without prejudging the waste, Franz didn't want to wait too long to figure out how to solve the problem. Of course, this would doom him to a very tiring life. April 17, 1842, Bombay. The dilapidated harbour in front of us was the Mumbai port, the most prosperous harbour on the Indian subcontinent in the past. When the huge warship of the Austrian Empire sailed into the harbour, it did not cause much of a sensation. Instead, it was deathly quiet. Even the merchants hawking were weak, and the goods sold were even mediocre, with only some salted fish and wine. The surrounding buildings are all rickety, as if they were pieced together with lumber. But what's even more frightening is that such dilapidated buildings can still stand, which is really amazing. It has been a month since that tsunami, and Mumbai at this time is even more dilapidated and less repaired than the Kolkata we left before. Although this is also related to the fact that Mumbai is closer to the epicenter and suffers more serious damage, this efficiency is still horrifyingly low. In fact, the rapid resumption of operations of the port of Calcutta was mainly due to the forced intervention and efficient management model of the Austrian Empire. The work efficiency of people in this era is inherently low, coupled with the fact that merchants who believe in free trade are raising prices, and the British colonial government's haphazard command has made the progress of rescue and recovery work very slow. Of course, what really makes people depressed is not just these. That is, the Port Authority prohibits dock workers from sitting on the ground and raising prices. The consequences for violators will be corpses hanging on the huge terrace when entering the bay. And because of the previous tsunami, almost no one was spared, except those foreign merchant ships and fishing boats that happened to go fishing in the deep sea. This resulted in overcrowding in the port docks, and of course the Royal Navy would certainly enjoy priority treatment. This makes the already dissatisfied people even more dissatisfied. For 19th century merchants, ships and their cargo were all they had, and these people were willing to do anything to preserve their fortunes. Therefore, when the crew who had nothing to do and were waiting for replenishment of supplies just got off the ship, they immediately became the object of competition among many parties, and the originally lifeless port also regained its vitality. However, Franz was not interested in bringing goods to these merchants. After all, the port of Mumbai was similar to the previous Calcutta, both of which were world famous for black goods. Franz has no interest at all in becoming an accomplice of drug dealers, and the Austrian Empire has done anti-drug work for so many years. Wouldn't it be a slap in the face to be associated with these people at this time? Although Archduke Friedrich, the commander of the Austrian Imperial Navy, seems a bit undisciplined, his soldiers rarely act too undisciplined. After all, the Navy's salary is very high, about 1.4 to 1.5 times that of the army, and Friedrich never showed mercy when he killed people. Sure enough, without the permission of the commander, let alone bringing people on board, even a piece of cargo would not work. Moreover, 90% of these black goods were shipped to the east, which was exactly the opposite direction to Franz and his party. But even so, a businessman still stopped a low-level officer who seemed to be more talkative and stuffed something into his hand. Naturally, this could not escape Franz's eyes. After all, this was what he had been staring at in the cabin. The low-level officer looked at the money in his hand and thought about what the other party said. Although he felt it was outrageous, it was a good thing for the Austrian Empire, so he reluctantly agreed. Then, it's up to you. The businessman looked very humble and spoke in Dutch, but in the opinion of the Italian officer, it was no different from German. Anyway, he could understand a little bit, but not quite. I can only report to the officer above me. As for what he said, I have no choice. The officer just told the truth. He was just one of the boiler chiefs of the Venetia, just a lieutenant. It was usually impossible for him to meet the fleet commander, since he was always on the lower deck point. However, the fleet commander Friedrich often led people to inspect various warships, so the lieutenant felt that his immediate boss should be able to talk to Archduke Friedrich. The businessman opposite was obviously a smart man, and he immediately took out a few more gold coins and stuffed them into his hand. "Please, help me. Please bring my message to the fleet commander of your country. If you can do it, you can come to me at the Poseidon Trident Hotel and I will pay you double the reward. My name is Ben-Abin." The lieutenant was very satisfied with the merchant's generosity, so he turned and walked towards the flagship. After all, Friedrich was observing the city from the bow. What? A fragile city? These idiots actually built a fort so far away. What's the use? Will the enemy march close to the coastline when attacking? Friedrich carefully observed the distribution pattern of Bombay's 10 batteries, 9 of which were forward batteries, covering the main battery point. In theory, this is correct. However, those forts built on the mountainside were too far from the entrance to the sea, and they lost the advantage of flanking the enemy with the fleet in the bay point, because the design of this kind of fort in the bay actually uses the advantage of the reverse slope to avoid enemy artillery fire, forming an angle with the civil warships in the bay to cover the enemies entering the bay point. However, the fort in Bombay Bay has very obvious shortcomings. It is more than 5 kilometers away from the mouth of the bay. The range of most of the artillery in this period did not exceed 3 kilometers, and the artillery in Bombay Bay was obviously some outdated artillery. In other words, the 10 forts here, including the main fort, were completely furnished. Faced with such a port with obvious flaws, Friedrich could not conquer it, which really made him sigh. At this time Friedrich's adjutant reported to him. "Report. Explain, Lieutenant." Beres, the boiler chief, said that there is a businessman who wants to be the governor of Slaveburg in the Austrian Empire. Slave Castle is located in Tanzania, East Africa, and is a famous slave trading center. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.